181. Let's go find Lu Wei. The Easter holiday was useless to Ada. Students couldn't leave the school, and professors still left them with piles of homework. It was no Christmas, far less fun. The one perk was the weather, spring at last, warm breezes and bright days. Ada shed her heavy winter coat for something light and started once more to walk galleon by the Black Lake. Since discovering a possible way to beat the puppet, she had been spending more and more time in the underground room. Even with a method, though, she still couldn't defeat it. Knowing your weaknesses and knowing how to fix them weren't the same as actually fixing them. Rome wasn't built in a day. Ada needed to sharpen her timing, squeeze the most advantage out of each spell, and make her attacks less predictable. It was equally important to stop falling into rigid routines that opponents could learn. It was a difficult process, and she would need time and discipline to break old habits. Fortunately, she was hard on herself and young enough to do it. The school itself remained oddly calm. Quirrell looked paler and thinner by the week, but he hadn't made any moves. The twins joked he might not even get past Cerberus Fluffy. You couldn't entirely blame them for laughing at the supposed villain. Quirrell had worn a reputation as a good-for-nothing for so long, students assumed he had the weakest magical ability of any staff member, barely ahead of Hagrid and Filch. Filch never showed off magic, he just swept with a broken broom. Hagrid, guardian of the Forbidden Forest, didn't seem to use much magic either. If he did, it wasn't obvious. He was simply terrifying enough without it. That Quirrell, as a core subject professor, got lumped in with those two, said plenty about how little faith people had in him. Even Bathsheba Babbling, who had once admired Quirrell, looked at him with a mix of pity and disappointment. One afternoon, the sky was so blue it could have been a forget-me-not. Ada sat on a boulder at the lake's edge, while Fred and George rolled up their trousers and waded in the still, cool water. Galleon chased butterflies nearby. The twins were skipping stones. They'd bet a sickle on whose stone would bounce the most. George's rock skipped 5 times. Fred handed over the sickle and then threw the rest of his stones into the water in a sulk. "This life is too dull," Fred complained. "Let's find something to do." Ada rubbed her earlobe and offered, "Want me to make you a set of practice questions? I promise they'll stave off boredom." "Absolutely not," George said, waving her off. "Exams aren't for ages, and we've actually been listening in class this year." "I didn't think I had it in me to sit still that long," Fred added. "I'm starting to admire myself." Ada flattened her mouth into a practiced smile and clapped once. "Mrs. Weasley would be so proud," she teased. Of course she'd be proud. 2 brilliant little Weasleys, George crowed, matching his brother. Then, as if on cue, Fred brightened. "All right, 2 excellent Mr. Weasleys. How about we go find Fluffy tonight?" Ada's suggestion won instant approval. That midnight, the 3 of them crept into Hagrid's hut and down into the chamber where the giant 3-headed dog lay. Fluffy didn't roar. The creature had gotten used to their visits. It watched them with all 6 eyes, and any closer, and those iron jaws would not have hesitated. Cerberus was famously untamable. No one could approach it except its owner, but familiarity counted for something. Still, they were not Hagrid himself, and Fluffy wasn't fooled by faces alone. Ada had come prepared. She began to whistle. There was no cheaper instrument than her mouth, but it wasn't an easy tune. She'd practiced until she could carry a melody, and the sound mellowed Fluffy's heavy breathing. The beast's body began to rock. Minutes later, it had fallen into a deep sleep. Fred and George quickly lifted the trapdoor. Below, it was pitch black. Before the twins could ask what to do, Ada kept whistling. The brothers steeled themselves and jumped down. Ada followed. They didn't hit the hard floor. Instead, they landed softly on a heap of plants. Ada flicked her wand Lumos, and light shivered out into the tunnel. As the light spread, the ground's greenery unfurled like a nest of pale snakes, vines probing and curling. The plants tightened around the students, trying to strangle them. The devil's snare snaked over Fred and George fast, while it seemed oddly hesitant around Ada, veering away from the glow of her wand. "Why does this look so familiar?" Fred called, already half-bound, his legs trapped. "More than familiar. We learned it in herbology." George yelped as the vines wrapped his limbs. Ada recognized it immediately. Devil's snare, the cold, clinging plant that loved darkness and damp and strangled anything that struggled against it. "Relax," she ordered. "Don't struggle." Her voice did something. The snare loosened its grip around Ada when she went limp enough to stand on the ground. The twins, trusting her, stopped fighting as well. The vines slackened. With a shudder, the three of them fell forward onto solid earth. Fred lay there, breath coming easier. "First time I've ever been happy to be flat on the ground," he muttered. "This mass of devil's snare must be Hagrid's herbology contribution," George said, rubbing his arms. "Like the Cerberus from Hagrid, there are other professors' bits and pieces down here." Ada nodded. The thought was unsettling in its way. If the devil's snare had come from Professor Sprout, what else lay ahead? Flitwick, McGonagall, Snape, Fred began counting on his fingers. "And Dumbledore, did I miss anyone? And our dear Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Quirrell," George chimed in, adding him to the list with a flourish. "Just please, not Trelawney or babbling," Ada said. She'd sat through divination once and hated it. Ancient runes taught by babbling was worse. It wasn't just relearning a language. Many runic symbols were lost or disputed, and the field was full of gaps. Translating an ancient runes text was often guesswork. As the manuscripts dwindled over the centuries, the meanings had to be pieced together from fragments, and mistakes were easy. Ada had seen translations that didn't move her progress at all, or worse, led her astray. It was a mercy, she thought, that whatever system tracked her learning didn't punish her for those dead ends. Uncertainty was one of the worst things there was. 182. Queen's Chess Game. Without lingering over what might be waiting for them, the three of them pressed on along the only path, a sloping stone corridor. Ada had the feeling they were already deep beneath Hogwarts, though she couldn't tell whether this tunnel went deeper than the secret room on the 5th floor. At the end of the corridor, a bright room opened up, full of tiny jewel-like birds, beating their wings and darting everywhere. Opposite them stood a heavy wooden door. The flying things were enchanted keys. That was Professor Sprout back there. "Who's this?" "Madam Hooch?" Fred asked. "I'd bet on Flitwick," Ada said. She took the broom George handed her. The brooms had been left in plain sight, as if anyone who came this way ought to see them. Watching the keys, Ada felt a little prickle at her scalp. She first cast a slowing charm to slow the fast-moving keys, then layered a freezing spell to try to stop them. The two spells combined, and the keys drifted more than flew, not completely frozen, but slow enough. Mounting the broomsticks, the twins quickly located the right key and opened the door. When Fred and George climbed down again, they kept their heads lowered, surprisingly sober for the moment of success. "You noticed it too?" Ada asked. "It's too simple. Simple enough for a first year," George said, incredulous. The longest part of the journey had been that corridor. The challenges themselves had been straightforward. They had mocked Quirrell as useless, but if he had no real skill, would he have dared aim for the Philosopher's Stone? The three rooms they'd passed so far didn't look like they could have stopped someone with real ability. The next chamber had been pitch black until they entered, then the torches flared to life, revealing a giant chessboard with towering pieces arranged across it. They could only get through by winning a game of wizard's chess. "Even after being apart so long, I miss Ron," Fred said quietly, looking at the carved, looming pieces. "Ada, it's your turn. Haven't you always called yourself the queen on the chessboard? Show us what you've got," George added. Neither twin was particularly skilled at wizard's chess. "Wait here." Ada sounded brief, then stepped into the queen's square. The living black queen slid off the board and gave her place to Ada. As Ada took up position, the white side began with a pawn 2 squares forward, the long-standing opening called the queen's gambit. The white flank pawn advanced, offering itself, and Ada accepted the sacrifice. She'd practiced this opening countless times with Ron. When white chose the queen's gambit, she knew exactly how to reply. She maneuvered her pawn in, knocked the white piece down, and settled into the middle game. The white queen prowled across the board with frightening force, knocking pieces aside. Ada, as the black queen, advanced cautiously from d8 to d7. The white queen captured a pawn at b7, leaving only one pawn between her and Ada. Fred and George watched from behind the black ranks, tense. "If it goes wrong, we run," George muttered. "We're only here for the fun of it." Ada flicked a hand behind her, telling them not to worry, and kept playing. White held the upper hand for a while. After losing 3 pawns and a bishop, Ada castled to tuck her king safely in the corner. She lost a rook that had tried to chase the white queen, but finally found an opening to check. The white king shuttled away and blocked, aligning with its rook, but Ada pressed on. She moved to g6, then diagonally to h5, with just a pawn between her and the white king. The white side counterattacked desperately, sacrificing a bishop to give check and then taking Ada's knight, but the checks never found Ada's king. Her king was guarded, the sacrifices were wasted. By the time the smoke cleared, black still had 3 pawns, a rook, and a bishop. White retained a queen, both rooks, a bishop, a knight, and even had an extra pawn. But it was Ada's move. She used her wand to topple the pawn at g2, cleared a path, and as the black queen she delivered the final checkmate. The white pieces, noble in defeat, quietly toppled. White had commanded the game for much of it, but by choosing the queen's gambit at the start, they had handed Ada the sequence she knew best. She had lost to Ron many times in exactly this opening, and those losses had taught her how to win. Victory was inevitable once she recognized the pattern. It was only a question of how she would finish. The chess pieces made way, and the 3 of them entered the next room. A disgusting smell hit them the instant the door swung open, a rank, foul mix of dirty socks and an uncleaned privy. Ada almost wished she could go back and play another game. A 12-foot troll stood in the center of the room, swinging a huge club. It had not yet noticed the intruders. Fred elbowed Ada. "Think this was the Halloween troll?" he whispered. They'd only stunned that troll on Halloween and never known what had become of it. This one was much bigger than that memory, and they hadn't seen the Halloween troll up close, hence the guess. Trolls were frightening in size and scent, and they were partly resistant to magic. But they were also incredibly thick-headed. Their brains were small, and it crippled their tactics. When the troll swung and charged, the twins put on a quick feint that drew its attention. Ada dashed in and struck the back of its head hard. The troll stumbled and slumped. They slipped past its stinking bulk and moved forward. The next challenge was a wall of flames ahead and another behind, and on a table sat 7 oddly shaped bottles. Fred and George picked up a parchment. A riddle explained the contents. 1 bottle would get them past the black flames ahead, 1 would send them back through the flames behind, 2 held nettle wine, and the remaining 3 were deadly poison. Ada read the note, Snape's handwriting. She felt a small flare of annoyance. The puzzle was almost insulting in its simplicity. She didn't bother to puzzle it out aloud. Instead, she lifted each bottle to scrutinize it and sniffed one of them. Then she produced a small flask from inside her robe, took a sip, and handed it to the twins. "Drink this," she said. "Once you've had a bit, you can go through the black flames up ahead." The twins each took the flask and sipped. George gave her a sideways look. "You didn't make all of these yourself, did you?" "The next chapter will be a bit late. Let me eat first." 183. Plans change. Ada had made all the potions on the table except the nettle wine. Even when she hadn't brewed a particular bottle with her own hands, she knew them by sight and smell. She squinted at the array, sniffed a few, and picked out the ones that would pass through the black flames. Her pockets were usually full of snacks, but today she'd packed 2 vials of fireproof potion she'd made herself. Snape had insisted she brew them. There was no harm in being prepared. After they drank, the black flames licked at them, but did no harm. The 3 of them walked straight through and came into the final chamber. A mirror of Eris stood in the center. Ada breathed out with relief. There was no ancient runes checkpoint. A little alarmed, she also felt uneasy. It had been far too easy. If a first year could have reached this far, so could someone with less motive than them. "Is this the mirror you were talking about?" Fred asked, pointing. "The one that shows what your heart desires?" Ada nodded. "Go on then. See how ugly your hearts are." "Don't worry, it's not as ugly as yours," George said, and pushed ahead. "We won't see ourselves with the stone making piles of gold." When Ada had explained the mirror to them earlier, she'd told them what she'd seen, parents she'd never known, and the scene of stone turning to gold. The twins stood side by side and, in unison, complained, "Why is your greatest desire in my head too?" They did not mean it unkindly. They'd been inseparable since infancy and were forever teasing one another. "What did you see?" Ada asked, and then stepped in front of the glass herself. The mirror showed the same as before, a healthy Ada and an unfamiliar young couple. "George and I opening a joke shop," Fred said. "Our stuff is a hit, it makes people happy, and we make a lot of money." They spoke together again, seeing the same scene. "There's one difference," George added. "In mine, I'm the older brother." Fred looked at him as if the thought had come from somewhere unexpected. Ada remembered twins at the orphanage who squabbled nonstop about who was older. The Weasleys had never seemed to care. Apparently, George did, after all. "What else?" Ada asked. "Your desires are simple." "Of course there's more," Fred said. "I saw you counting coins behind the counter." "Even if you were all disheveled while doing it," George added, "you looked like you were in pain and in joy." Ada was momentarily speechless. Counting money was a rare, uncomplicated pleasure, unless you were counting too little of it, or counting it for someone else, like the curse-breakers at Gringotts. She had been envious of Bill's job for a while. Finding treasures and breaking curses sounded exciting. But then she'd seen the other side. Day after day, spotting glittering things that were not yours at all, and the envy faded. They stood before the mirror a long time. The twins struggled not to let their minds wander, but the mirror showed nothing of the Philosopher's Stone. Ada could not drag the stone out by occlumency or any trick. The mirror simply refused. The earlier challenges had been showpieces. Even a first year could have gotten past them, but this final test was the real safeguard. As long as it stood, the stone was safe. Eventually, the three retraced their steps. The troll lay still, unconscious as before. The giant chess pieces in the chess room had reset to their starting positions, and now, on their way back, the pieces made way for them of their own accord. Each checkpoint restored itself. They left undetected. They chatted and laughed as they pushed open the door onto the fourth-floor corridor and found Professor McGonagall waiting there. Face stern and flushed, she must have been watching for them. Without a word, she led them through the castle to the head's office, where Dumbledore waited. Dumbledore had been told someone had broken into the forbidden corridor. He had expected Quirrell to have finally lost patience. It was a disappointment to find it was only Ada and the two boys. He had instructed McGonagall to wait and bring the students straight to him. In the head's office, silver instruments breathed out cold mist, and Fawkes the Phoenix tilted his head from his perch. Nobody spoke. The quiet before a reprimand was worse than the rebuke itself. The twins' hearts thudded. They'd broken rules before, but never like this. Ada, who had always been forthright about owning up to mistakes, felt no fear. Dumbledore had once allowed her a chance at the stone. She had failed to obtain it, but she had no guilt. "What were you doing there?" Dumbledore asked, though he already knew the answer. His half-moon spectacles caught the candlelight. "Looking in the mirror," Ada said plainly. "We looked for a while and then came back. We didn't see so much as a shadow of the stone." The twins stared, impressed by her composure. "Ada," McGonagall snapped. "So, did you get it?" "No." Ada kept her tone flat and direct. "The checkpoints you set were impregnable. We couldn't find a way through." Dumbledore blinked, unsurprised by the truth. "Have you given up?" he asked. "A long time ago," Ada said. "We just went because we were bored." "And to see if I had made any other preparations," Dumbledore said, pushing back from his desk to stand before her. "What I promised still stands," he added. "But next time, let one of us know, either me or Professor McGonagall. You don't have to go through this to prove you're stronger than Harry. You are not on his path. Once you start comparing yourself to him, you've already lost." "I didn't." Ada's voice was firm, and for the first time in the room she raised her head and met Dumbledore's blue eyes. Her anger was plain. He felt the reproach, and though he knew the remark might wound, he had spoken to probe, to understand how she viewed Harry as part of a larger plan he was piecing together. "Professor, we really only went there because we were bored," the twins blurted, eager to explain. They had no idea how much Dumbledore and McGonagall valued Ada, but they were sure she mattered less in their eyes than Harry did. "Albus, she wouldn't think that way," McGonagall said softly. "She's her own person. She doesn't need to compare herself to anyone." The office fell quiet. Dumbledore considered them all, then, after a long pause, waved his hand. He did not impose any formal punishment. "Tonight," he said, "you are to remain in your dormitories and not go anywhere else." "Yes, Professor," the boys murmured, still chattering. Ada said nothing and left the office with her jaw set. Fred and George hurried after her, trying to catch up. Only Dumbledore and McGonagall remained. She looked at him with concern. "Albus, you shouldn't think of her like that." "Perhaps I was wrong from the start, Minerva." Dumbledore removed his spectacles. "I overlooked her own mind." In his plan, everyone had a role toward a larger end. If necessary, sacrifices could be made, Harry, even himself. Ada had not been in the plan. Her sudden emergence, however, had intrigued him. It had been a long time since someone like her had turned up, and he suspected she might go on to greater things. He had tried to fold her into his arrangement as a kind of insurance, but now he saw that including her would tilt the whole scheme unpredictably. That was a risk he would not accept. He stood by the wide-open wooden door, lost in thought, until McGonagall departed. 184. Part ways: anger, irritability, disappointment. Ada, who had just left the headmaster's office, couldn't find the words for what she felt. All she knew was that something wild lived inside her, itching to roar, to vent, maybe even to kill. The first time she had killed a wizard in Little Winging, she had half expected days like this. Watching an enemy die, seeing the light leave their eyes, feeling the heart of slaughter pulse with blood, there was a part of her that reveled in it, a disregard for life that frightened her. Maybe she shouldn't blame that one killing. The real fault lay with herself for living so hypocritically, pretending to be a timid white rabbit until she had almost forgotten who she was. Bitter and chaotic thoughts crowded her mind. Dumbledore saw her as someone who might threaten Harry Potter. Today had been a warning, perhaps a gentle one, but what if there was a next time? If that was how things were, then it was better to part ways cleanly. Dumbledore and Harry could take the broad road, and Ada would take her narrow one. No one should have to be a constant irritation to the other. If they no longer wanted her around, why should she keep throwing herself at them? Even if Lord Voldemort rose and shouted Avada Kedavra, Ada thought she could carve out a way to survive on her own. She would not stay and suffer this humiliation. "Ada! Ada! Wait for us!" The Weasley twins, who had followed her from the headmaster's office, finally caught up. She wasn't headed for the common room. Perhaps she didn't even know where she was going. She heard their calls but didn't stop, walking on without a destination. Fred and George took 2 quick steps and grabbed her, one on each arm, holding her in place. "Stop! Do you want to wear us out dying of worry and then seize the joke shop all to yourself?" Fred said. "I'm telling you, don't even think about it. We're going to live to a ripe old age." "Right," George chimed in. "Good people don't last. Scoundrels do. We'll be around forever." Then, more seriously, "Don't be gloomy. Do you know how awful you look when you hold it all in? Smile. Or if you like, we'll smile for you." They grinned together, an ugly, toothy parody of a smile, and Ada couldn't help the small, involuntary laugh that escaped her. They were irresistible in their absurdity. "Once you smile, you'll see. We'll always be by your side. Don't mind Dumbledore. Don't mind Harry." "Shut up," Ada snapped. She hadn't wanted to hear those names. The words left her harsher than she meant. She realized it and softened. "I'm sorry, George. I shouldn't have." "If you're sorry, don't call me George," said the other, feigning indignation. "I'm Fred." "I'm sorry, Fred," Ada replied, and was glad she could at least tell them apart. George's nose was straighter, Fred's face a touch rounder. Fred spoke more instinctively. George tempered things with a calmer head. Fred was bolder, but George carried himself more like the elder brother. Before they could settle, an unwelcome figure cut into the corridor. Argus Filch, the caretaker, with Mrs. Norris trailing at his heels. The cat let out a hissing meow. Filch raised his lamp and grinned at the 3 of them. "Ha! Not in bed in the middle of the night, are we? Wandering the corridors, just the sort of nighttime trouble I was hoping to catch. I've got you now." All 3 winced, but the twins' worry was not about being caught out of bed. It was about Ada. If she was this unstable, Filch was standing right in the line of fire. If Ada lost control, there was no telling what would happen. "Filch, we've already been punished by Professor McGonagall," George said, stepping between Filch and Ada and waving for Filch to leave. You can ask her tomorrow." Filch's face lit up with the thrill of catching troublemakers, and he ignored the plea. "Caught you. Now you'll come with me. Straight to Professor Dumbledore. I'll have the headmaster expel you myself." At Filch's feet, Mrs. Norris arched her back and fixed her yellow eyes on Ada, emitting a sharp, urgent yowl. It was as if the cat sensed the danger Ada represented. "Night walking, expelled. Fine," Ada said, voice low and dangerous. "Would you like an excuse? How about I attack a member of staff and make your day?" Her wand was still in her pocket. She did not intend to use it. She only wanted to show Filch she would not be trifled with, to make him back down. "Threatening school staff earns a worse charge than walking the halls," Filch snapped. "You'll be expelled for that." Fred, quick and practical, spun around and wrapped his arms around Ada, turning them both away from Filch and giving himself a solid hold. He leaned in and whispered, "Calm down. Just let George handle him." George put on his most imploring face and tried everything to get Filch to go away. If Filch kept pushing, the twins thought, it wouldn't end well. Ada could lash out. She didn't strike to be beholden to anybody. If she hurt Filch, it wouldn't stop there. Avery, Trelawney, Flint, Quirrell, no one who'd crossed them would be safe. Then the brothers would either have to run or watch Ada taken to Azkaban. "Whatever you're doing here, didn't I tell you to be in bed?" came a voice of controlled impatience. Professor McGonagall had followed them and now stood watching the standoff. At her appearance, both Fred and George exhaled in relief. "They've been punished already," she said to Filch. "They may return to their dormitories." "But, Professor—" "There are no buts," McGonagall interrupted sternly. Then, turning to the twins, "Take Ada back." Fred and George hustled her away, careful and protective. McGonagall watched them leave but did not follow. She thought any more attention from her might only drive Ada farther away. "Professor," Filch complained, undeterred, "she threatened to attack a member of staff. This can't be let go." "Did she lay a hand on you?" McGonagall asked without turning. No, she didn't." "Then what are you arguing about?" McGonagall snapped. She left, leaving Filch muttering, and intended to write to Mrs. Weasley, hoping Mrs. Weasley might know how to reach Ada's temper and heart both. Filch wondered, briefly, whether he should go straight to Dumbledore, but he did not know where to find him. Elsewhere in the castle, Dumbledore stood before the mirror of Erycid, a place Filch would never have been welcome. He let his hand rest lightly on the glass. "It seems I have made another mistake," he murmured, the words barely more than a breath. "A mistake like the one I made with Tom." He spoke softly as if to himself, and perhaps as if to whatever answer the mirror might offer. After returning to the common room, Ada didn't head straight to the dormitory. She settled into an armchair by the fireplace, quiet and still. The twins sat opposite her, watching every small movement, as if waiting for her to do something reckless. "You don't have to keep staring," Ada said. "I'm not going to do anything stupid. Isn't it tiring to watch me without blinking?" They shook their heads together. "We know you won't hurt yourself," Fred said. "But we can only relax once we see you're calm." If Professor McGonagall hadn't shown up, Filch would probably be in the hospital wing right now, George added. "Ada, you might not want to hear this, but I still have to say it." Ada leaned back and looked up at the common room ceiling. "Go on," she said. "I'm listening. What Dumbledore thinks doesn't matter. What anyone else thinks doesn't matter. What matters is you," George said earnestly. "As long as you keep your head and do what you have to do, that's enough. Other people's opinions won't take anything from you." Ada knew what he meant. She had never cared much for school gossip, but Dumbledore's words that day were more than casual opinion. To her, they felt like a warning. If she wanted to stay, she needed to behave and not give in to impulse. She wasn't Harry. She didn't have everyone cleaning up after her. In Ada's view, everything Dumbledore had done for her had always been in service of Harry, removing the danger of the Obscurus so she wouldn't be a ticking time bomb beside him, developing her talents so she'd be useful in guarding him, training a fighter for the coming war. Harry was at the center of it all. She was an auxiliary. Tools are expected to obey. They are refined to be convenient. If they remain inconvenient, they're discarded. It was a bitter thought, and the worst she could imagine about Dumbledore. If that were true, she would lose his protection, and everyone she'd upset, Avery, Fooley, Flint, maybe Malfoy, would come calling. "I understand," she said instead. "Today was anger. I'll be fine tomorrow." She didn't voice the darker possibilities. There was no reason to worry the twins with them. They kept watching, knowing she was holding something back and that they likely wouldn't pry it out of her. "It's late. I want to rest," she added and went back to the dormitory. It was late, approaching dawn, after their excursion past the fourth-floor challenges, the detour through the head's office, and Filch slowing them down. The twins exchanged helpless looks in the common room and didn't return to bed. They waited, unwilling to sleep while she might still slip away. In the dormitory, Ada sat on the edge of her bed, thinking. Angelina, Alicia, and Katie slept on, unaware of when she'd left or returned. Sometimes Ada envied them. They had no remarkable talents, but their lives were simpler and happier. The world went on with or without her. She wouldn't collapse into self-pity over the possible loss of Dumbledore's favor. There were ways to live without him. She found the glasses the system had given her, the ones gathering dust in her cupboard, and put them on to hide the redness in her eyes. After a moment, she left the dormitory again and returned to the common room. Fred and George dozed in their armchairs. A snap of her fingers made them sit bolt upright. "Go get ready," she murmured. "We'll go down to breakfast soon." They would rather have stayed. Both feared she might run. Though the thought had crossed her mind, she hadn't left, not yet. Seeing her sit motionless, the twins dragged themselves to wash. They were exhausted from the night's events and moved quickly, then slowed when they saw she was still there. They genuinely worried she'd vanish into the storm outside. They walked the corridors and climbed the stairs in silence. None of them brought up what had happened earlier. It couldn't be undone. Ada had made up her mind. She no longer wanted to bargain or place-hate. Sitting on the bed earlier, she had realized it was better to see reality clearly and stop nursing impossible expectations. There would be no more knitting lessons to learn for anyone else's sake. At breakfast in the Great Hall, Ada ate quietly, out of place amid the rowdy students. Even Fred and George, while greeting friends and telling the occasional joke, were subdued. The night's events had affected them all. The trials under the trapdoor, except the Mirror of Erised, had felt like arrangements made for Harry. The twins understood why Ada had reacted so strongly and thought it unfair. If Snape's heart could be biased, it seemed Dumbledore's could be even more so. From the moment Ada entered the hall, Professor McGonagall watched her closely. Ada sat quietly, neither loud nor disruptive, and McGonagall's concern grew. She resented Dumbledore's choices all the more. And Dumbledore? He was at the Shrieking Shack, standing before the weather-worn sign that read, "Beware of Dog." He could imagine Ada's private amusement at the sight. He pushed open the door and let the morning sun warm his face. He didn't come here often, but the shack felt different now, bright and clean. A rocking chair and a small round table sat by a window that let in warm, slanting light, as if its owner often sat there to enjoy the sun. A teapot and matching cups rested on the table, and one magazine lay open on another. The Quibbler lay folded nearby. Dumbledore sat in the rocking chair and picked up the magazine. To his surprise, it wasn't about magic at all. The open page showed knitting patterns, how to knit a scarf, and a folded page taught how to knit socks. He closed it and allowed himself a small smile. He could hardly picture Ada as a knitter, yet he remembered the pair of rough wool socks she'd given him at Christmas. He'd complained they were scratchy. She had set about learning to knit better. Wool socks, he thought, always seemed to carry with them a meaning of family and companionship. Ada's act had been simple, almost childlike, and yet it had come from something genuine, care spurred by the protection he'd shown her. The sunlight on his face felt warm and comfortable. For a moment he had forgotten something important. Ada was a child who loved the sun. 186. Quirrell's Thoughts. After breakfast, Ada, Fred, and George went to class. Their first lesson was Charms with Professor Flitwick. Flitwick was one of the more lenient teachers at Hogwarts. He rarely fussed about classroom discipline and didn't mind if students nodded off if they could manage to. As long as they did not disrupt his lecture, he looked the other way. When the class seemed listless, he would abandon the lecture for a while and lead them in a few magical games or tell stories to lift their spirits before resuming. That morning's lesson was the cheering charm, a spell to raise a creature's spirits. Flitwick explained the incantation and the crucial points, then demonstrated the wand movements. The class followed along, waving their wands and reciting the words. Ada had always done well in class, but today she was a shadow of herself, dragged down by the exhaustion of a sleepless night. When free practice began, she rested her head on the desk and fell asleep. Charms was easier than transfiguration, and Flitwick was famously good-natured, so daydreaming, or even napping, was forgivable. Flitwick corrected mistakes one by one. He noticed Ida's lack of participation, but didn't comment. Everyone had lazy days, he thought. Occasional slackness wasn't worth a reprimand. The classroom filled with the sounds of swishing wands and cheerful incantations. But Ida and the twins did not join the merriment. All three lay down and slept through the exercise. Fortunately, none of them snored, because that would have been too disrespectful to Flitwick. They slept until class ended. If Angelina and Lee Jordan hadn't nudged them awake, the trio might have kept sleeping. Rubbing a slightly numb arm, Ida sat up. A short nap had left her worse off, more tired than before. She and the twins shuffled to the great hall for lunch, then back to the classroom for defense against the dark arts. That was a class even better suited to sleep. Quirrell taught nothing useful anyway, so catching up on rest seemed preferable. Angelina and Alicia exchanged glances at the sleepy Ada. They guessed that after Ada had fallen asleep the previous night, she must have slipped out of the dormitory and been out for a long time. Otherwise, she wouldn't be this exhausted. The three had shared a dormitory for 3 years, and they had grown used to not seeing her at odd hours. At first, they asked what she'd been doing, but later stopped bothering. If Ida could talk about it, she would, and if not, questions were pointless. The twins were already out cold. Ida was not. She toyed with her gold-rimmed glasses. She'd had them 2 years, but still didn't know their purpose beyond hiding dark circles. When she wore them, she looked softer, less bold. The spectacles made her seem like a delicate, refined girl. Just before the next class began, Quirrell appeared at the doorway. He peered in cautiously. When he saw nobody attending to him, he walked to the front and stood atop the podium. His entrance drew a stifled ripple of laughter, and he laughed along, though the smile was awkward and forced. He had lost weight since the start of the year. His face was paler, as if he had suffered. The sickly look made him appear pitiable, but the change had been his own doing. When the bell rang, he began his lesson, and the room settled into the familiar, awkward dance. He struggled to lecture, and they struggled to listen. Ida removed her glasses and lay her head on the desk again. The room grew noisier as students practiced spells, but she drifted off quickly. Quirrell made a show of trying to restore order, but he had never earned their respect. No one truly listened. He continued his lecture all the same, but his attention kept drifting to Ida. At Halloween, Quirrell had released a troll into the school to create chaos and to give himself an opportunity to get near the corridor on the right side of the 4th floor. Snape had ruined that plan by appearing just then, and Quirrell had been forced to hide and watch as his scheme collapsed. He had expected Cerberus, the creature he had hoped would bite Snape, to finish him off. Instead, Ida and the twins had arrived, saved Snape, and left him entirely unsuspected. He had watched it all with burning resentment. Quirrell hated Snape for spoiling his plans. He hated Ida for trusting Snape so completely. From that night on, he knew Snape's presence would be a problem for any of his schemes. He needed to find a way to hold Snape back, or better yet, to bring him down, so his own plans could proceed unhindered. Now in class, watching Ida sleeping on her desk, Quirrell realized that, aside from Snape, this popular girl from the student body could be another obstacle. Whenever he looked at her, at what he imagined was contempt in her eyes, he felt mocked. He saw her as a clown to be ridiculed. When his plan succeeded, he vowed to make her pay. Ida, deep in a sweet dream, had no idea she had become his focus. If she had known, she would have protested loudly. She could have sworn by Merlin that there had been no mockery in her gaze toward Quirrell. She only saw him as ridiculous. Quirrell's theatrics had only fooled a few gullible first-years like Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Anyone with half a brain could see that he was not to be taken seriously. Most of the school watched Quirrell expecting an entertaining performance. Only Quirrell remained convinced of his own brilliance. Time blurred. Ada felt as if she'd closed her eyes for 2 minutes. When she opened them, the defense against the dark arts lesson was over. Students packed and filed out, calling greetings to friends. Quirrell stood on the podium, awkwardly watching them leave. No one greeted him. Only the first years, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, gave him encouraging smiles. Ida had gathered her things and was ready to go when Quirrell's stare, heavy with malice, made her stop. She turned and asked bluntly, "Something wrong?" She used no honorific. Even when she disliked Snape, she still called him Professor Snape out of respect for his skill. Quirrell, however, had shown her nothing worthy of respect. To Ada, his most unforgivable fault was that he'd been appointed Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts, and thus led students astray. "Nothing," Quirrell stammered. "Absolutely, and nothing at all. If there's nothing, I'm leaving." Ida cast him another glance and walked out. She suspected she hadn't misjudged his expression. Quirrell simply couldn't admit it. Malice aimed at a student did not fit the harmless pretense he otherwise cultivated. A crack in one's character could lead to ruin. Quirrell stood and watched her go, a smile frozen on his face. He found it odd that her look had seemed softer than usual, less sharp. He told himself he was overthinking it. If Ida truly had injured Filch the previous night, he would have learned today how capable and how dangerous that stumbling block of a girl could be. 187. Suspicious Dragon Egg. After a chaotic day, Ada's life settled back into routine. There was still so much to do. If she was going to face the coming storms on her own, she had to grow up fast. The only way to secure herself was to reach a combat level comparable to Professor McGonagall or Snape. Wizards who could stand at that level were rare. Once she matched or surpassed them, she would no longer have to fear ordinary threats. Only the likes of Dumbledore or Voldemort could really endanger her. Voldemort, of course, was not someone she could reckon with on any level. He was simply in a different league. As for Dumbledore, Ada did not believe he would do anything monstrous. If she didn't actively sabotage his plans or line up openly against Harry, she had no reason to be on his bad side. Dumbledore was far too intelligent to harm himself for the sake of making enemies. With the Easter break over, Hogwarts grew busy again. Teachers pushed on with new material while reviewing earlier lessons. Some students grumbled about the workload, while others woke with a jolt to the fact that finals were fast approaching. Madame Pince was more irritable than usual when handling Ada. Every time she checked Ada's borrowing record, it took forever, whether from genuine attachment to the books or from the strain of so many pupils using the library. She made a fuss. Rumor had it she was allied with Filch, and perhaps she felt she should defend him after Ada's earlier run-in. Whatever the reason, Madame Pince became a constant, scolding presence, feather duster in hand, shooing anyone who violated library rules. There was, however, one person she invariably failed to drive away: Hagrid. He seldom came to the library, and his size made it impossible for Madame Pince to force him out. Lately, he'd been popping in to read, decked in that ill-fitting moleskin coat of his. It might seem odd to picture Hagrid absorbed in a book, but when the books were about dragons, it made perfect sense. Dragon keeping had been illegal for common wizards since 1709, and Hagrid had never minded dismissing a rule if it stood between him and dragons. He had longed to keep one for as long as anyone could remember. Raising dragons was the very thing he and Charlie talked about the most. It was hardly surprising that if Hagrid suddenly produced a dragon egg from his coat, Ada would treat it as an entirely natural Hagrid thing, exactly the sort of thing her hero would do. The question, of course, was where Hagrid had gotten the egg. Ada and the twins didn't go grilling him. If he really had a dragon, it wasn't their business to pry into the source. Others would do that for them. As soon as Hagrid left the library with his borrowed books, Harry, Ron, and Hermione trailed after him. Ada didn't need to think to know they would want to find out whether Hagrid had a dragon, and if so, where the egg had come from. The incident didn't disturb Ada's routine. She kept to her plans. It might have slipped her mind entirely if Ron's sudden hospitalization hadn't dragged the dragon question back into focus. On Thursday at lunchtime, after she and the twins ate, They went to the hospital wing to see Ron. His arm was swollen to twice its normal size, rounded and club-like. Fred gave it a tentative poke, and Ron let out a high, piggish squeal. "Tell us, what happened? How did it swell up like this?" George asked, sitting on the bedside. Ron mumbled something weakly. "A dog bit me," he volunteered, but his voice lacked conviction. "If you want to convince others, you must first convince yourself." Ada stepped forward and inspected the bandaged hand. "Maybe I should unwrap it and take a look," she said. "Then we'll have Galleon bite little Ronnie again. That'll prove if it was a dog." Fred brightened. "Why didn't I think of that? Ada, you're in charge of unwrapping the bandage. George, you distract Madame Pomfrey. I'll go get Galleon." No, Ron started, realizing too late he was being led into one of their jokes. He'd been tricked again. He then went quiet for a long moment, cheeks flushing, and finally admitted, "It was a dragon. I was bitten by a Norwegian ridgeback." Ron told them, shamefaced but honest, how he'd been injured and where the dragon came from, mentioning the letter from Charlie. He also confessed what Harry had seen after the Gryffindor-Hufflepuff match. Harry had seen Snape threatening Quirrell in the Forbidden Forest. That was the reason some of them had begun urging kindness toward Quirrell. Because Ron had been so forthcoming, there was a sense he might receive a gentler punishment. Hearing Ron's account cleared up the mystery of Hermione's sudden stubbornness. She had seen the same thing as Harry and fully believed him, convinced Snape had been the aggressor. Ada listened without saying much. Whether Snape or Quirrell had been playing a part in misleading them, both adults were manipulating the first years. Quirrell hid his own motives and made them suspect Snape, while Snape played his role and made the suspicion seem genuine. The three of them, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, had been led by the adults without thinking to look for what lay beneath the surface. What puzzled Ada more was that none of them had questioned the origin of the dragon egg. She hesitated. Should she say something? In the past, she wouldn't have hesitated at all. She would have marched straight to Hagrid's hut with Fred and George and demanded to know where it had come from. But things were different now. She couldn't act so bluntly. The egg's sudden appearance at such a critical moment was too convenient, too coincidental. It made her suspicious. Yet Hagrid was overjoyed and oblivious, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione, already aware the Philosopher's Stone might be at stake, displayed a disappointing lack of curiosity about the stranger who had handed Hagrid the egg. "Ron," Ada said finally, "didn't it occur to you to be suspicious about this egg?" "Norbert?" Ron blinked. "What's wrong with Norbert? Charlie's coming to take him away soon." Fred snorted. George, however, understood exactly what Ada meant. "There's nothing wrong with the dragon," he said. "But isn't it odd that some stranger just turned up and gave Hagrid an egg?" 188. Chance to win the Academy Cup. By now, it should have been a serious problem that Hagrid kept a dragon of unknown origin, but Harry, Ron, and Hermione were only thinking about sending the troublesome creature away to protect Hagrid. The dragon's origin and any hidden meaning behind it didn't interest the trio. Ada's warning might make them take it more seriously, or it might be ignored, but it no longer mattered to her. She had no intention of getting further involved. Who had lost the dragon egg to Hagrid, why someone was watching him, or when Quirrell might act were no longer her concern. Protecting the Philosopher's Stone was a test Dumbledore had set for Harry, not a game Ada could play by her own rules. After leaving the hospital wing, Ada hurried to Ancient Runes. She stepped into the classroom just as the bell rang. If she had dawdled another moment, she would have been late. Professor Bathsheba Babbling was continuing the translation of an old manuscript she had been working through. The text recorded a wizard's ancient discourse on the origin of magic, written in fairly simple runic characters, perfect for beginners. Ancient runes, derived from Norse and Germanic alphabets, had once been common across Scandinavia and the British Isles. Besides being used for inscriptions, the runes themselves were believed to hold mystical power. The wizarding world generally traced the roots of modern magic back to the north, and runes were essential to any search for those origins. Ada was fascinated by the subject and hoped mastering the runes would open a path to older, deeper power. Babbling finished explaining the manuscript, and the students busied themselves with notes. Then, true to form, The professor drifted away from the lesson into Norse mythology. Frey, the god of fertility, Hag, the god of obstruction, Tyr, the god of war, and from there into a complaint about the Ministry of Magic. If no one interrupted her, in another 5 or 10 minutes, she would be on some completely different topic. Professor Bathsheba Babbling's mind wandered in unpredictable directions. You never quite knew where it would land. Today it could have been Madame Malkin's new stock, the state of runic scholarship, or she might loop back to the lesson. The students, however, had grown used to her detours. Babbling's rants were usually amusing and helped them, in their small way, understand the adult wizarding world. Ada and Cedric beside her compared notes, then settled back to listen to the professor's asides. Ada didn't need to grasp adult life in full, but she did need to understand the adult wizarding world, employment, status, alliances. In 4 years, she would have to think about a career. How does she have so much to say every class? Cedric muttered, then answered himself. She must not see many people outside school. It all bubbles up. He corrected a line in his notes with a practiced flick of his quill. You don't talk much normally either. Don't tell me you'll end up like her. How do those girls around you put up with you then? Ada shot back. Cedric, with his good looks, steady grades, and ministry connections, seemed destined for bachelorhood unless he changed his terrible habit of blurting things out. I don't treat you like an outsider, he said. I'm just straightforward. Answer my question. This is class, Ada said. Should I be talking or should the professor be? She added, I can be talkative, but even the most chatty person gets bored of someone who always kills the conversation. Cedric wasn't really a conversation killer. He was popular for a reason. He just didn't bother to perform witticisms around Ada. Their friendship thrived on plain, honest talk, not strained charm. Before the bell, Professor Babbling at last steered back toward the lesson. But it was too late. The topic wouldn't be finished until the next class. You couldn't be a Hogwarts professor without quirks. If you lacked them, you'd stand out too much among the other staff. After class, Ada and Cedric went to the Great Hall. Passing the giant hourglasses that tracked house points, Cedric grinned. Congratulations, he said. To what? Ada blinked. She hadn't the faintest idea. Your house points. Cedric nodded at the sand of rubies in the Gryffindor glass. I hadn't noticed before, but you lot have pulled so far ahead of Slytherin. You've got a real chance at the House Cup this year. Gryffindor had lived up to its name. The rubies in their hourglass sat nearly 40 points above second-place Slytherin. With a little over a month remaining in the term and one Quidditch match still to come, their lead looked solid. Anything can happen, Ada said, keeping her voice level. Don't forget, Slytherin still has Professor Snape. Cedric laughed. If you and Fred and George rein them in a little, that 40-point gap should hold. He meant the Weasley twins. Mischief tended to attract point deductions, but he trusted they would be careful. Professors usually docked 1 or 5 points. Taking 10 was a serious business. Except for Snape, who seemed to delight in bleeding points like water, most teachers used deductions to correct mistakes. With the end of term near, staff would be more cautious about stripping points. Barring a major scandal, 40 points should be safe. Looking at the hourglass, Ada felt it too. This was Gryffindor's year. If the house could stay out of trouble, pick up a few more points, and keep Snape from exploiting any slip-ups, the cup would be theirs. The Great Hall buzzed with plans to solidify their advantage. 2 students at the table, however, were not cheering. Harry and Hermione sat with frowns, worry heavy on their faces. Ron was still in the hospital wing, and Hagrid's dragon, Norbert, was weighing on their minds. Until Norbert was sent away, they could not relax. Worse, Malfoy already knew about the dragon and knew the trio planned to send it away on Saturday. The thought of that secret getting out, or of making a mistake that would undo a whole year's effort for the House Cup, set their teeth on edge. 189. Internal Strife. In the days that followed, the Gryffindors kept themselves as quiet as kittens, careful with every step as if guarding a fragile trophy. They clung to their 40-point lead with painful precaution. Having been the ones to lose the most points over the previous 2 years, Trist and the Weasley twins, Fred and George, were under close scrutiny. Percy and another prefect had each pulled them aside to speak. Trist found the attention infuriating and treated the prefects coolly, though she complied with their demands. Even so, Gryffindor could not hold on to the lead. On Sunday morning, the students found the heartbreaking scene at the giant hourglass that recorded house points. The crimson gems that had been brimming were gone. Only a pitiful handful remained trickling at the bottom. Overnight, Gryffindor had lost a full 150 points and fallen from first to fourth. A dense crowd of Gryffindors gathered around the hourglass, faces drawn and disappointed, while passing Slytherins paused to gloat and taunt. The taunts only sharpened the anger pointed at Trist and the twins. It was natural, everyone thought, that if anyone could lose that many points so suddenly, it would be Trist and the two Weasleys. As if on cue, Trist, Fred, and George appeared, discussing George's latest fireworks idea and walking toward the Great Hall without noticing the crowd. The gathered Gryffindors fell silent and then surged forward. A half-dozen students stepped in front of the trio, blocking their path. The group accused them of recklessness and of letting Gryffindor's chance at the House Cup slip away. Most of the insults, however, were aimed at Trist in particular. Taken aback at first, Trist, Fred, and George listened as the accusations mounted. "You made the house lose 150 points in one night. We demand an explanation," Kenneth Towler snapped. Towler had grown bolder since last year. His tone made it sound as if George were the insolent one. Several others who disliked Trist's methods chimed in. "The more talented you are, the more people wait to bite at you when you stumble. We're just as upset about losing the points," Fred said. "But what does this have to do with us?" No one present actually knew how the points had been lost. They simply assumed that it must have been the three of them based on past behavior. Trist, who had been quiet up to then, shoved Fred and George aside and stepped forward. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she said, "First, those 150 points have nothing to do with us, so we don't owe you an apology. Second, even if we did lose them, what right do you have to block us and insult us? What do you intend to do about it?" Her gaze cut over the students who had formed the blockade. "Do you want to beat us up or kill us?" Those words were a spark. For a moment, the crowd hesitated. Some had already been ready to back down, thinking perhaps it wasn't them, but Trist's challenge left them trapped between pride and retreat. They could not very well take the first course she suggested in front of so many witnesses, and if they stepped back now, their reputation would be damaged. Angelina and Alicia, who had hurried over at the rumor, grabbed for Trist, trying to pull her away. Lee Jordan planted himself beside the twins, his eyes on the would-be opponents as if choosing targets for a fight. Percy forced his way through the crowd and put a calming hand on Trist's arm. "Trist, calm down," he said, and then to the crowd, firm and loud, "This has nothing to do with Trist, Fred, or George. I've asked a professor." There was a murmur. Towler, who had been eager to blame Trist, scowled. Before the scores of voices could erupt again, someone in the crowd stepped forward and said loudly, "It was me. It was my fault. I'm sorry, everyone." Heads turned to the speaker. It was Harry Potter, the hero of 2 Quidditch matches, standing there with Hermione and Neville at his side. The revelation hit everyone like a bucket of cold water. Harry had caused the loss. Hermione and Neville bowed their heads, but no one paid them much attention. Trist and the twins' earlier fall from grace receded, the students' attention fixated on Harry instead. A few muttered insults were aimed at him, but nobody dared to surround him the way they had surrounded Trist. The name carried weight. Percy seized the moment. "It's been a misunderstanding. Go to the Great Hall and eat. Disperse." Percy's intervention gave everyone the excuse they needed to step back. The crowd began to break up. Even curious students from other houses lost interest and drifted away. Then Trist's voice cut across the dissipating noise, soft but carrying far. "Wait, who gave you permission to leave?" Only a few minutes had passed since the trio had first been surrounded, but in that time someone had gone for the professors. They arrived quickly. Snape reached the scene first and stepped between Trist and the rest. "Put your wand away, Trist," he said. "All of you, disperse." Trist ignored him, pressing past Snape and flashing her wand. Snape grabbed her arm, close enough to hiss in her ear, "Whatever you intend, do it without your wand." "Professor, don't interfere," Trist snapped. Today I'll show everyone whether a mudblood is made of mud or not. Her words were not idle cruelty, but a raw stab born of humiliation. She had been the target, silenced while held up to scorn, and she would not be treated like a plaything. The thought that Dumbledore had tolerated such treatment in the past only made her angrier. Professor McGonagall arrived then, hair slightly mussed from running. She stepped in front of Trist's wand and, meeting Trist's furious eyes, said sharply, "Lower your wand." Reluctantly, with eyes still red, Trist obeyed. McGonagall turned her attention to the students who had blocked the trio. "Apologize," she ordered. "I will not say it twice." The students who had stepped forward began to apologize at once. Trist's readiness to use a wand in front of a professor had unnerved them. Dumbledore himself appeared on the staircase, calm and measured. "Prefects, escort your house students away," he said. Then he addressed the matter of discipline. "All students involved in surrounding Miss Trist and the two Weasleys will each lose 10 points and will serve detention until the end of this school year." He paused, and then, with his usual gentle authority, he turned to Trist. "Miss Trist, come to the headmaster's office with me. Minerva Severus, you will come as well." 190. A journey without knowing the destination. Professor Dumbledore's arrival put an end to the morning's chaos. Students dispersed under their prefect's direction. Snape followed Dumbledore and vanished down the stairs. Professor McGonagall kept a firm hand on Esmeralda's shoulder, offering whatever warmth and strength she could. In the Gryffindor common room, the young housemates clustered in 3s and 4s in different corners, standing, sitting, but all talking about the same thing: what would become of Esmeralda Twister. Attempting to attack another student and refusing a professor's intervention had many convinced that the enraged headmaster would expel her outright. People imagined her returning soon to pack her things, wand snapped in half. Fred and George sat in armchairs, knuckles white from gripping their fists. Food that the house elf had brought sat untouched on the coffee table. When they rose to head for the dormitory, Angelina stopped them. "What are you two doing?" she demanded. "Going to write to Dad," George said. This isn't entirely Esmeralda's fault. Esmeralda had been wrong to try to attack a student. That was her greatest mistake. But the cause of the incident, they believed, was not hers alone. If she were expelled while the real culprits only received a month's detention, it would be a terrible injustice. "Are you serious? Do you think Mr. Weasley can influence Dumbledore?" Angelina shot back. "Then what else can we do?" Fred snapped. "Sit here and watch them throw Esmeralda out, or go to the head's office and beg for mercy?" "Maybe it won't be that bad," Alicia Spinnet offered. "Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall always liked Esmeralda. Maybe she'll only be severely reprimanded." Fred cut her off with a derisive laugh. "Don't be naive, Alicia. Dumbledore? He's just itching to kick Esmeralda out to make room for his favorite." "No." Neville, who had kept his head down until now, spoke softly. "My gran said Professor McGonagall treats Esmeralda like she was her own. She wouldn't let that happen." Neville had seen Esmeralda at St. Mungo's and remembered his grandmother's opinion. Harry and Hermione, sitting nearby, were worried too, but the twins' words threw them. It didn't match what Ron had said. According to Ron, Esmeralda was Dumbledore's favorite. Dumbledore had even come to the burrow that summer looking for her. "What are you saying? Dumbledore's going to kick her out and make room for a favorite? Isn't Esmeralda Dumbledore's favorite?" Harry asked, confused. The twins wouldn't meet his eyes. George stayed silent. Fred spat. "It's all because of you. Because of you." He stopped abruptly when George cut him off. Both brothers blamed Harry's presence for the change in Dumbledore's attitude toward Esmeralda. Though neither sent the blame entirely Harry's way, Harry couldn't control what Dumbledore thought. The coffee table fell silent as everyone turned over the words, "It's all because of you." Angelina and Alicia understood instantly. Katie Bell looked puzzled. Lee Jordan tried to calm Fred and George, insisting they keep their heads if they wanted to help Esmeralda. Hermione understood the implication. Harry's arrival had driven a wedge between Dumbledore and Esmeralda, though she didn't know why. Today's events had happened because Esmeralda took the blame for Harry, was cornered and insulted, and reacted too far. Harry himself hadn't yet grasped why this was connected to him, not from ignorance, but because he had not fully appreciated how much his presence affected those around him. The common room door opened, and Professor McGonagall entered. Every head turned. She moved toward the girls' dormitory, as if to pack Esmeralda's things. The twins stepped in front of her. "Is Dumbledore really going to expel her?" Fred demanded. "This isn't all Esmeralda's fault. It isn't fair," George added, losing his composure. McGonagall's presence had made them frantic, as if Esmeralda's fate were already sealed. Angelina, Alicia, Lee, and the others pressed around McGonagall, begging her to go to Dumbledore and rescind any order. "Mr. Weasley, please mind your language. It is Professor Dumbledore," McGonagall said, hands raised in a calming gesture. "I am simply here to pack some things for Esmeralda." The words "pack some things" caused the twins' heads to spin. Fred, unable to contain himself, shouted, "Just because Esmeralda comes from an orphanage, she has to keep taking blows? Has she done anything less than everyone else?" Since meeting Esmeralda, the twins had seen how careful and self-reliant she was. In a world that felt foreign to her, if she didn't look after herself, who would? And yet, the only reply they got from McGonagall was that she was here to pack a suitcase. The twins felt it was pointless, like everything they'd done for her had been wasted. If they had known this would happen, maybe they would have lived differently. Perhaps following Glover Cecil to learn the dark arts would have been a better fate than watching her be sent away. Professor McGonagall watched the twins and felt a quiet satisfaction. These two impulsive boys genuinely cared for Esmeralda. Angelina, Alicia, Lee, and even Katie Bell, who wanted to speak but didn't dare, cared for her too. McGonagall could not help but be pleased. "First," she said, "as Deputy Headmistress and Dean of Gryffindor, I have not received any notice of expulsion." She looked at them evenly. "Second, I am here only to pack Esmeralda's things. She is going on a long journey, and I cannot very well have her leave in school robes." "Isn't that still expulsion?" Lee muttered. "Not at all," McGonagall replied. "This long journey is Professor Dumbledore's punishment for her, but I promise you, you will see the day Esmeralda returns to school." She paused, then added, "Now, who can tell me what books Esmeralda has been reading lately?" Later, on a quiet Hogsmeade lane, Esmeralda walked behind Dumbledore, wearing a sky-blue robe. Since she had entered the headmaster's office, she hadn't said a word. Dumbledore had spoken only to McGonagall and Snape. He had asked McGonagall to prepare a travel bag for Esmeralda and told Snape to continue watching Quirrell and Harry Potter. The handbag Esmeralda carried, a small bag made larger inside by an undetectable extension charm, had been packed by McGonagall. It contained clothes and a few books she hadn't finished. Esmeralda didn't know their destination, but it certainly wasn't Azkaban. Azkaban wouldn't require new clothes, and she would never be allowed to keep her wand. Still, she kept herself ready to flee at any moment. If anything seemed wrong, she would apparate away. Even if escape was impossible, she would try. After passing the Hogsmeade post office, Dumbledore turned down a narrow alley and led her into the Hog's Head. Because it was still early, the pub was empty. The innkeeper, wiping a glass until the cloth grew dirtier, looked up with a sullen scowl as Dumbledore entered. "Could you prepare something for her to eat?" Dumbledore asked. "Our young lady has had no breakfast, and it would be cruel to travel a long way on an empty stomach." The innkeeper stared at Esmeralda for a long minute before muttering and setting the glass down to prepare food. Dumbledore, familiar with the place, led Esmeralda into a small, secluded room. It was surprisingly clean, unlike the usual disarray of the Hog's Head, and felt private enough for whatever lay ahead. A tidy little room hidden inside the Hog's Head? Ida found it hard to believe. She had been in the pub once before with the twins, and compared to the scruffy wizard who ran it, she much preferred Madame Rosmerta. At least her mother's friend kept things clean. Ida looked the place over, but Dumbledore was watching her. He had been unsettled all day by the words he'd spoken. He should have seen sooner how heavy their consequences would be. The girl who outwardly seemed indifferent to others' opinions was internally fragile. His remark had cut her, had made her pull away from Hagrid's dragon episode and then choose the most irrational solution she could think of today. Dumbledore's gaze dropped to Ida's right arm. Since leaving the headmaster's office, her hand had been thrust into her robe pocket. He didn't need to ask. He He knew her fingers were curled around her wand. One sentence had opened a chasm between them, a distance Dumbledore had not expected. Ida noticed him watching, but remained defiantly unconcerned, refusing to pull her hand free. Even when the Hog's Head owner set down their food, she kept her wand hidden, stubbornly eating with her left hand, as if to prove a point. Holding on to her wand was the only way she could feel safe facing whatever unknown lay ahead. The pub owner didn't leave when he'd brought their meal. He took a seat behind Dumbledore and said, "I've seen you before, little one." "Yes, sir," Ida answered around a mouthful, still using her left hand. "I was in your pub a year ago." "You were only a second year then," Dumbledore interjected. "School policy, Hogsmeade." "If it weren't for this girl," the owner cut in, looking straight at Dumbledore, "you wouldn't have even set foot in my place today. Where are you taking her? Azkaban? St. Mungo's? To be a prisoner, or to be studied by the madmen at the hospital for the rest of her life?" Both men looked at Ida as if they were peering into an old memory. The pub owner's eyes and brows had a familiar angle. Ida caught the likeness and glanced from him to Dumbledore. "You haven't changed," Dumbledore said helplessly. "Can't you give me a little leeway in front of my student?" "You still never think you might be wrong," the owner spat. "Did you ask her? Did you ask if she wanted any of this?" Dumbledore's gaze returned to the pocketed hand. "It's precisely because I know I was wrong that I decided this," he said quietly. "This is my final decision about her." Talking about Ida's life with Ida, sitting there listening, left the room suddenly thin with silence. After a short pause, the three of them rose. Outside, Dumbledore prepared to leave. Ida had rested long enough. He extended his left arm toward her. Ida, however, stepped to his right and took his forearm instead, keeping her right hand and the wand inside it secure in her pocket. The pub owner snorted. "That's right. Don't trust him. Don't let his silver tongue sway you." Dumbledore smiled at the man with something like resignation. "When I return, I hope we can have that long overdue dinner," he said. With that, he and Ida vanished. They reappeared with a dizzying lurch by the sea. Seabirds wheeled overhead, waves battered the cliffs, and a salt wind filled Ida's nose. "The White Cliffs of Dover," Dumbledore said. "A halfway stop. He hasn't arrived yet. We'll wait here." They stood for 10 minutes against the breeze before a hunched, shabby old man came up the path carrying a rusty bucket, which he set down beside them. "2 more minutes," he muttered. Dumbledore nodded. He didn't reach out with his left arm again. Instead, he rested a firm, steadying hand on Ida's shoulder. When the old man finished his count, Dumbledore stepped into the bucket. Ida felt herself propelled like a gust of wind, the seaside blurring into streaks. The bucket seemed to pull the world around it like a magnet. When she came to a stop, she could no longer hear the crash of waves. The air was dry and thin. Magic had a way of turning even travel into the unexpected. She had hoped wizards would take an airplane one day for the novelty of it. "Where are we?" she asked. It was the first time she had opened her mouth to Dumbledore all day. He pointed to a chain of snow-capped peaks that hemmed the valley in. A dark, forbidding castle loomed on a cliff, a single tall tower thrusting toward the sky. "Inland Europe, Austria," he said. Ida's thoughts went to Gellert Grindelwald. After his defeat, the dark wizard had been locked away in a prison he had built, Nurmengard. They followed a rocky path up the mountain. The castle's high walls offered no temptation to scale them. The place looked grim and absolute even in daylight. At last, they reached a broad stone platform that must have been the entrance, though no door was visible until Dumbledore raised his wand and spoke a long, complicated charm. Slowly, the great portal disclosed itself, worn wood, iron fittings dulled by years, all of it speaking of a grandeur that had long since faded. Above the newly revealed door, carved into the keystone, the familiar inscription stared down in stark letters, "For the greater good." 192. 3 chapters of the agreement. In front of Nurmengard Castle's main gate, an old man and a young girl stood lost in their own thoughts. Ada stared at the carved words as if they might explain the past, while Dumbledore drifted through memory. For the greater good, those fell words summoned a chapter of European history everyone preferred to forget. A long war, broken families, and 2 young men whose relationship grew from camaraderie into love and then mutual destruction. Dumbledore lingered at the gate without speaking until Ada tugged his sleeve and the greatest wizard of the magical world returned to himself. "Is this the final decision?" she asked, squirming with uncertainty. She didn't believe Dumbledore had brought her here to be imprisoned. She was not that important. "Yes," Dumbledore said softly. "I think he's better suited to guide you than I am. You can learn much from him. It will save you many detours." His voice dropped. "Go in. I hope you two get along." His face made no attempt to hide anything. It was calm, neither joyful nor bitter. When he did not move, Ada asked again, "Aren't you coming in?" "No, I'll wait by the door. If he refuses to take you in, I'll bring you back to Hogwarts." Gently, he pushed her forward. Ada looked at him once more, then squared her shoulders and pushed open the heavy castle door. Grindelwald had built this place decades ago. The carpets were threadbare, the stained glass windows broken and pocked, rusting suits of armor lay scattered, and chandeliers lay shattered on the floor. Dust rose in little whirlwinds under Ada's feet. The portraits on the walls had long since flaked. Their faces were unrecognizable. Her fingers brushed a dirty long table and the ruined high-backed chairs. In that motion, the castle's former life seemed to unpeel itself for a moment. She imagined Grindelwald and his fervent followers once clustered around this very table, goblets raised, dreaming aloud of a new world. They had followed their great leader for the greater good, through thorns and sacrifices, convinced wizardry should dominate. Now those ideals had withered. Names turned brittle pages in the history of magic. A thin, gaunt man descended the winding staircase, his clothes tattered and his eyes empty. He moved slowly, like a ghost of the place, or the place made flesh. The sight surprised Ada. Who would have believed the once powerful Gellert Grindelwald could be reduced to this? Yet his heterochromatic eyes betrayed who he was. There was only one prisoner this castle held. Despite his frailty, his posture remained unusually erect. Ada had to accept, this skeletal figure was the first Dark Lord. Grindelwald leaned back in a high-backed chair and studied the intruder. Sunlight through the windows caught Ada's golden hair and made it gleam. Here she was, a girl of school age, in this desolate mountain prison where entrance was difficult and masking charms were not easily undone. It was precisely because the gate's magic had been undone that Grindelwald, alarmed, had come down to see. He regarded Ada as if she were a pilgrim unaware of danger, the descendant of an old friend, or perhaps an avenger. He lifted a hand, and a stately surge of magic flowed toward her, meant not to injure, but to drive the intruder away. Ada drew her yew wand across her chest and split that magic in two, sending it skittering against the stone walls in a plume of settling dust. She pressed her left hand, and the airborne dust dropped, settling as if nothing had been disturbed. Such composure and skill were not what one would expect at her age. Grindelwald made no further attempt. He spoke first in German. "Durmstrang?" When the girl did not respond, he tried French. "Beauxbatons?" "Hogwarts. I'm from Hogwarts," Ada said. She did not understand the language he used, but his words mentioned the famous continental schools. "And him?" Grindelwald's heterochromatic eyes finally sharpened. Ada pointed to the entrance. "He's at the door. He didn't come in." Grindelwald moved briskly to the door, no longer seeming infirm. He did not look back. He left the room and went out. Alone in the great hall, Ada set about cleaning the high-backed chairs in the long table's immediate area. She put her handbag on the table, sat, closed her eyes, and let the castle's past soak into her. Imprisoned in a place he himself had designed, Grindelwald felt less like a prisoner than an exiled sovereign, like Mary at Carlisle, Napoleon on Elba, or Wilhelm II on Dorne Manor. Compared to Grindelwald's treatment, even Voldemort hiding in the Albanian jungle seemed almost coddled. After a while, without knowing what the two men outside had agreed, Ada opened her eyes and began to amuse herself. With a gesture, she conjured white buds into her palm, which bloomed instantly. The blossoms rose and drifted around her, shifting into butterflies that fluttered, encircling her in a riot of color. Grindelwald returned just in time to see the display. He had met many prodigies and had heard Dumbledore's account of Ada's talent, so he showed no surprise. He sat back down at the far end of the table. The two faced one another across the scarred wood. "You may stay," Grindelwald said, "but on 3 conditions." Ada waved the butterflies aside. I was exiled here by mistake, not by choice. I don't want harsh rules, if you please, Dark Lord. Grindelwald listed them curtly. First, you are forbidden from entering the top floor. Don't disturb my life. Second, do not pry into my past. Curiosity will make me dislike you. Third, if you think I will teach you out of pity for him, you are gravely mistaken. I have no interest in educating a conceited child. If you can keep those rules, stay. If not, leave now. Don't waste anyone's life. Ada tapped the table lightly. Those are reasonable. I have no objection. I'm a guest seeking temporary lodging, and I ought to respect my host. I do have a few practical questions. The old man examined her with heavy scrutiny. Speak, he said. Try to be sensible. First, there are many empty rooms. Where should I sleep? Second, where do I wash, and what about bathing? Third, may I clean this place? You may stay wherever you wish, except the top floor. If you enjoy stargazing, you may sleep outside, Grindelwald said, gesturing to his right. That washroom still works. For a proper bath, use the lake behind the castle. As for cleaning, do as you please. He added, someone will bring food and water weekly. They will leave the provisions on the platform at the entrance. From today on, you will be responsible for collecting them. 193. Prisoner life in Nurmengard. For decades, the castle had been Grindelwald's alone, but today it admitted another occupant, a presence that might bring a little color back into its cold halls. After showing Ada how to enter and leave the castle, Grindelwald turned and went upstairs. The first-generation Black Demon King had nothing more to say to her. Letting Ada live here had already been a concession to Dumbledore. This was Nurmengard, not a counseling center, and Grindelwald had no interest in tending to a troubled girl's feelings. Once the owner left, Ada explored the first floor. Apart from a vast, empty hall, the level consisted of practical rooms, reception rooms and the like, with none suitable for sleeping. Climbing the stairs, she finally found a room that pleased her. Though called a bedroom, it was more of a loft, a small sitting area beyond the door, then another short flight to the sleeping space. What she liked most were the oversized floor-to-ceiling windows. Leaning on the railing and looking out at the snow-capped peaks stirred something grand in her chest. The first thing to do was clean. Dust lay thick on the floor, and motes drifted in the air. The place was unlivable as it was. The hard bed frame lacked a mattress. Bookshelves stood empty where tomes once had been. A carpet's original color was lost, and portraits were little more than frames. Fortunately, having helped clean the shrieking shack with the house elf Winnie before, Ada found the work straightforward. As she worked, she felt the room had once belonged to a woman, or at least been arranged by one. Not gaudy or pink, but exceptionally cozy. It took her a whole afternoon to bring it back to order. Then she turned to what Professor McGonagall had left for her. She dug through her handbag, enchanted with an undetectable extension charm, and brought out 3 outfits, a set of pajamas, 2 pairs of shoes, a few books she'd been reading, and some snacks, tea bags, cocoa powder, cream. Finally, she pulled out bedding. When that came free, the bag was empty. Ada liked to joke that she'd been exiled, but the things McGonagall had prepared seemed more like provisions for a holiday. If this had been a tropical isle instead of a remote Austrian mountain, and she'd produced a bikini, it would have looked unmistakably like a vacation. As dusk fell, a hungry Ada appeared in the castle's ground-floor storeroom. There was only bread and a handful of vegetables suitable for soup. No steak. Ada, a committed carnivore, scowled. She retracted any thought of Grindelwald as a mistreated exile. What exiled monarch lived on vegetable broth? Not even a rabbit could put up with that. She filled her own stomach, then took a simple tray up to the top floor. She knocked, set the tray down, and left. Whether Grindelwald ate it was his concern, not hers. Back in her room, she used a flame-freezing charm to light a fire in the hearth. The warm, magical flames chased the chill away. She found a large copper kettle, boiled water, and made herself a cup of hot cocoa, then settled at the railing with the Guide to Medieval Witchcraft. Her attention drifted, though. What she really wanted was the bread-baking book she'd seen at the Burrow, The Magic of Baking Bread. A book is only missed when it's needed. If she'd had that one with her at the Burrow, her days in Nurmengard would have been easier. She closed the medieval guide, wrapped her hands around the cocoa, and watched the silver moonlight. Her exile in Nurmengard had begun on this pale night, and she had no idea when it would end. She could have gone, she knew how to leave, and Grindelwald would not block her, but if she ran away, she might never return to Hogwarts. So she stayed. She and Grindelwald did not interfere with each other, each kept to his or her life. Grindelwald came downstairs only for meals and otherwise remained on the top floor. Ada, by contrast, lived freely. By day she read or rested in the castle, or wandered outside and found a tiny, simple mountain village. In the evenings she did light cleaning, not from any particular virtue, but because the place genuinely needed it. That quiet routine held for 5 days, until Grindelwald himself broke it. That morning he came down as usual for breakfast. Since Ada's arrival, he no longer prepared his meals. She needed more food than he did and got hungry first. Ada tore at her bread and greeted him without looking up. "Good morning." "Good morning." It was the first time in several days he had answered her. As he sat, Grindelwald noticed something unusual on his plate. Besides bread and vegetable soup, there was a slice of smoked meat. "Where did this come from?" he asked. The person who delivered provisions had not brought meat for years. Grindelwald did not worry over such trifle. "I traded for it with the villagers down the mountain," Ada said. "There are old artifacts in the castle the villagers like." After enduring dry bread for days, she had grown tired of it. Ada, who wanted meat, found the simple villagers and bartered with them. She had no Muggle money, but there were finely made old objects in the castle, so she used the oldest form of trade and swapped artifacts for meat. The villagers were kind and honest. They didn't treat her like a child hawking treasures, nor did she have to swindle them, though she had briefly considered trying to get something for nothing. Grindelwald had assumed she wouldn't last here, that she'd break down and beg to go back to Hogwarts within days. Instead, she'd stayed 5 days without complaint, and had even improved the castle's meals with her own methods, even if Grindelwald technically paid. The place was cleaner, brighter. Her quiet presence had indeed brought a measure of youth and life back to Nurmengard. "Why do you think you came here?" Grindelwald asked. Ada swallowed the last bite of bread. "I don't think I did anything wrong. I only returned what others did to me. If I had to admit a fault, maybe it's having this talent, or maybe being unhappy with my place. Magic only flourishes in a few souls. That is never a mistake. It is your right," Grindelwald said. "Your mistake is still being weak and lacking unshakable conviction." "Even now, you still think you weren't wrong?" she asked. "I admit my failures. I admit I caused pain to many people, but I never believed my ideal was wrong. Only the method I used to pursue it was," he replied. "I foresaw Muggles acquiring power greater than wizards, and that foresight is already reality. You come from the Muggle world. You must see it plainly." Planes, cannons, missiles, nuclear bombs, Muggles were no longer helpless before wizards. Muggle society advanced rapidly while the wizarding world clung to old ways and stalled. If the masquerade were broken and wizards and Muggles went to war, Ada would have little faith in the decaying magic community's chance. The Grindelwald, who had once nearly leveled Paris with a single spell, was a shadow of that force. Among the few remaining wizards, how many could match that? Unless wizards secretly dominated every level of Muggle power, something that would require mass control and secrecy, the advantage would tip to Muggles. But all that reasoning amounted to nothing if you could not first unify the magical world into a coherent force. "Almost impossible," Grindelwald said. If she doubted him, she could ask him, "Did he manage it?" "Because you waver, you hesitate when you act. If I were you, I would unite those ignorant students, and if they remained stubborn, I would give them an unforgettable lesson," Grindelwald continued. "Not begin with fire and end with ash, as you seem prone to do." 194. Words are like swords. In the 5 days they had been living together in the castle, this was the longest monologue the first-generation Black Demon King, Gellert Grindelwald, had given. He flung his opinions at Esmeralda and continued on with his breakfast. Grindelwald ate slowly. At his age, after a life mostly spent isolated as a prisoner, his body was like a candle in the wind, always liable to gutter out. He could not hurry even if he wanted to. Esmeralda's thoughts about the quarrel with her Gryffindor classmates largely matched Grindelwald's. She knew she lacked natural charisma and was no good at indoctrination. She had only wanted to teach them a lesson. But she had thought too long, and by the time she acted, Snape had arrived and stopped her. "I should be grateful he stopped me," she said. "Otherwise, I would have been expelled, just like you were expelled from Durmstrang." "I wasn't expelled for attacking a classmate," Grindelwald replied. "I was expelled because ordinary minds couldn't grasp a genius's vision. Besides, what's the difference between your situation and being expelled?" Grindelwald sneered. "Taken from school, banished to Nurmengard, no friends, no classmates, only the shadow of the Dark Lord for company. Other than being able to go for walks, what's the difference from Azkaban? Don't speak to me of Dementors. Only the weak fear them." That remark killed the conversation a little. Today, talk was difficult. Esmeralda pushed back. "So, what am I supposed to do? Go all out and use the killing curse on them, have my wand snapped, and be thrown into Azkaban to wait for death? At your age, don't let your mind fill with slaughter and bloodshed," Grindelwald said. "Is killing the only way you can prove your strength? Slaughter is the last resort, only when there are no other options. When people won't listen, you can force them," he continued, displeased. "But the method should not be slaughter. Apply force to suppress when necessary. Demonstrate your power that way, and let your mercy shine through." "If I do that, Dumbledore won't show me mercy," Esmeralda countered. "What do you mean by forming my own influence at school? Become the next Lord Voldemort?" She disagreed with his view. She could act against her classmates, maybe even intimidate them, but growing in influence would bring Dumbledore's memory of darker days to the surface. Grindelwald was disgusted by what he saw as her lack of ambition. "Are you really that afraid of your headmaster?" he asked. "You haven't done anything. How do you know Dumbledore will treat you like that other idiot? Just because you both came from an orphanage?" "It's not just fear," Esmeralda said, almost ashamed. "I honestly believe that if I worked hard and followed instructions, I could grow under Dumbledore's protection and be safe from Voldemort and the Death Eaters." "Ridiculous," Grindelwald said flatly. "Then why not decide to become the next Albus Dumbledore? Or the next Gellert Grindelwald," he added, setting down his bread and fixing her with a serious expression. "I need time," she muttered. "Excuses." He scorned her. "You even make excuses for your own weakness. Why should anyone value you? Why should you become strong?" He looked at her as one looks at a worthless rag doll. "By your talent? If you lack the heart to become strong, even talent will only make you a failure, pitiful, pathetic, a mudblood." Those words struck a raw nerve. Esmeralda sprang up, slammed her palms on the table, and shouted, "I'm a loser. Aren't you one too? Your followers are hunted by aurors, judged by ministries, and you can only hide in Nurmengard. What did you say? Lingering? I failed, yes, but at least I once stood at the peak. A weakling who can only look up at the summit from below, begging for pity. You have no right to mock me, someone who has fallen from the top." Grindelwald spoke slowly, weighing each word. "At your age, I was already preparing to be master of death, not whining I need time like some nagging woman." In his eyes, Esmeralda was exceptionally talented, but unprepared. She hesitated, missed chances, and lacked the composure of a truly strong person. If she continued like this, her gift would be wasted. He pressed on. "I heard you only killed 3 people and then worried you'd become addicted to the pleasure of killing, feared dark arts in every shadow. If that's the case, you might as well put on fine clothes and stroll Diagon Alley or be tucked away in some manor. Better than waving your wand and wasting your youth and this beautiful life." Esmeralda stared at him, fury blazing from her emerald eyes. "Harsh enough? Disgusting enough? I apologize, for your sake." Grindelwald rose and walked slowly up the stairs. "You only deserve my insincere apology. Respect must be earned. Do you have the strength and the will for that?" His words were brutal, like a slap or a needle in the eardrum. Grindelwald had chosen to wound her pride deliberately, to force her to face herself. If she could find that merciless heart inside, all would be well. If she broke instead, then Dumbledore's faith would have been misplaced. She would be nothing but rotten mud. For any ordinary girl, such verbal cruelty would be unthinkable. She would be wrapped in blankets and given dolls on birthday and Christmas. But Esmeralda was no ordinary girl. Her terrifying talent required that she endure this trial early. She would either rise to the mountaintop or be trampled into the earth. It depended on whether she could steel herself. Esmeralda sat back down, crushed, thinking for a long time. She had always chased perfection in magical execution and combat efficiency, never looking inward. Even supreme power needs an equally strong inner core to make it whole. She feared Dumbledore's power, dreaded Voldemort's return, worried she might fall in love with killing, and kept her distance from the dark arts. Too many fears had dulled her heart. She had lost the courage to be unrivaled. Even with help from the system, what would she become? Dumbledore's next tool, a useful blade in someone else's hand, rather than the next Dumbledore, rather than Esmeralda Twister. After an unknown span of time, she suddenly snapped out of her reverie. She stood, left the long table, and the light came back into her eyes. The clothes were the same as that morning. She was still the same girl who had not yet turned 15. Nothing outward had changed, yet everything felt different. 195. The Lost Dark Lord. Grindelwald's cutting words struck Ada like a blade, right through the defenses she had built around her heart. They shredded the barrier she'd been hiding behind and showed her how absurd her past hesitations had been. When that raw wound healed, the scab that came away took with it her old weakness, her former meekness, the self she had always thought insufficient. The Ada who emerged would be stronger, a witch with inner resolve to match whatever power she could summon. This change wasn't cosmetic, and it wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded in small, steady ways, in how she approached problems, in how she practiced magic, in the tilt of her chin. Over the following days at Nurmengard, Ada smiled more often, walked with lighter steps, and even found the energy to spar verbally with Grindelwald. Thoroughly scolded, she had been biding her time, waiting for some crack she could exploit, but Grindelwald was too cunning to hand her one. He mocked her from every angle. Her casting speed was as slow as a tortoise. Her uncertainty meant she was weak and soft-hearted like a woman. When she balked at the dark arts, he'd sneer, "If you can't even control your power, you might as well find a rope." In short, he called her useless. If Dumbledore's tutelage had been a gentle spring rain meant to coax Ada into growth, Grindelwald was a monsoon, drowning her in criticism. Brutal as it was, that approach worked. It jolted her awake during the confusion. It wasn't that Dumbledore was a lesser teacher. They simply had different concerns. As headmaster and the greatest wizard in the magic community, Dumbledore worried about pushing too hard, about tipping a pupil into danger or leading her astray. Grindelwald, an old man behind Nurmengard's bars, had none of those scruples. Unrestrained, he used the most direct methods. Whether Ada would throw herself into the dark arts for power or endanger the magical world was her problem, not his. Whether she became a second Dumbledore or a second Grindelwald, why should the imprisoned man care? He could not even be sure his own body would last long enough to see the outcome. If he died and the world burned, what difference would it make? Life at Nurmengard settled into a rhythm. Ada's conversations with Grindelwald increased in frequency and in range. Beyond endless criticism, he would debate her about the wars between wizards and goblins, about Muggle conflicts, and they reenacted World War I and II on a map. It was during one of these war simulations that Ada finally found her chance. She launched into a litany of sarcasm. "I heard you trained an army of wizards. Did you drill them in firing lines and volley fire? Could they withstand howitzer barrages? Could they stand up to a torrent of steel? Do you know what a decapitation strike is? The three great truths of warfare? Tactical infiltration? Carpet bombing? Last year's Desert Storm?" She rained modern military terms on him like a machine gun. For once, the arrogant Dark Lord was left speechless. Ada had scored her first victory in their war of words. Enraged, Grindelwald rudely chased her out of the castle's upper floor and banged the door as he shouted, "Don't forget, you're a witch now, not a muggle." Ada smoothed her hair and peered at the tightly closed door with disdain. Wasn't this supposed to be a discussion? Why get so angry? Triumphant, she left in a great mood and went back to scavenging through the castle. After Dumbledore and Grindelwald's duel, before Grindelwald's imprisonment, Ada had no idea what the castle had endured. She only knew it was stripped of anything valuable. The suits of armor she had rearranged were likely the most precious things left. The mountain villagers had no use for armor. They couldn't wear it to show off knightly valor. Ada gathered what she could: candlesticks, cups, copper pots, tableware, and bartered them in the village for food. Bacon, sausages. The villagers could keep the items or trade them farther afield for coin. Ada got meat, they got goods. A fair swap, and the only one who suffered was the old man living up in the castle's highest room. While Ada traded in the village, Grindelwald sat alone upstairs, stewing. He had been thinking about the changing balance of power between wizards and muggles. In the beginning, wizards had held clear dominance. King Arthur needed Merlin to become a king. Even through the witch trials, the powerful wizards still called the shots. Only the weak were persecuted. But to shield their vulnerable kin, wizards had to withdraw from Muggle sight. It was in this context that the seeds of the International Statute of Secrecy took root, eventually formalized in 1689, and the wizarding world retreated into hiding. Meanwhile, the Muggles marched forward. Technological progress gave them the means to destroy the world, while wizards stalled, clinging to past glories. The gap widened with every passing year. Grindelwald imagined, in bleak detail, what a true war between the two sides might entail. Even if wizards won, the cost would be catastrophic. Who could accept such a price? The Statute of Secrecy, he thought bitterly, had become a law morphed into self-preservation. Wizards had wasted too many opportunities. The thought filled him with a cold heartache. He skipped dinner that night and kept to his room. Upstairs, Ada enjoyed the dim view from her tiny garret. She noticed a scar on the distant mountainside, as if a chunk had been blown away. Grindelwald knocked and came to lean on the railing beside her, staring out into the night. "That mark on the mountain was made by an obscurus," he said. "I think his outburst was fed by anger, resentment, a sense of injustice. The force of that blow, it's intoxicating." Ada thought of her own recklessness spell, and knew even a dual cast from her would hardly leave such devastation. The power of an obscurus was something else entirely. "If I'm not mistaken," she said, turning back to the small table to make hot cocoa, "those negative emotions you mentioned, you guided them, didn't you?" "You guessed right," Grindelwald admitted, taking the cup she handed him. "I'm skilled at nudging people's hearts." His background made him vulnerable to those feelings. "I only needed to push a little for it to happen sooner." "Thanks for the cocoa. Are British people all so fond of sweets?" he asked. "I don't know. I like sweets because life is bitter enough already," Ada said with a soft smile. Grindelwald didn't chide her about not yet understanding bitterness. The girl's suffering wasn't romantic pain. Like Credence, she had a tragic childhood, though she was luckier than certain other children he'd known. Suffering was something you tasted alone. Others would never truly know whether your water was warm or cold. 196. Fantasy of Silver Moon Night. Someone once said that every person born into this world carries the sins of a previous life. The suffering of this life is payment for past wrongs. The sins committed now must be repaid in the next. Lives are lived to balance debts, and each lifetime is full of human suffering. Sometimes even breathing feels wrong. That was why, for a time, indulgences became so popular. The ignorant spent their fortunes on these so-called absolutions, hoping to wash away their guilt, win forgiveness, and ascend. Ida wished she could afford that kind of ignorance. If there were a place selling genuine indulgences, she might not squander everything on them, but she would buy some. She knew they were scams, but sometimes it's pleasant to be simple and happy. Trying to spend every moment of your life purging sin is a hard way to live. Grindelwald had chained himself to penance in Newmengard, repenting for his crimes and for what he called atonement. It was futile. What he and his followers had done could not be erased. He knew that. Although he never believed his ideals were wrong, once he had learned what love and affection meant, he chose to stay, turning his old slogan into the chains that bound him. "Everyone's life is full of pain and hardship," he said, as if warming his hands on the thought. "It's precisely because of that pain that every sweetness becomes precious." His voice, holding a strange tenderness, likened his hot cocoa to chicken soup. "Like this cup of cocoa, sweet and comforting because of the sugar and the milk." Ida raised her cup, fitting the mood, and took a long sip. "Too much sugar breeds dependence. Too much of it makes you sick," she said. "When you gorge on sweetness, your palate numbs, Once loved flavors turned bitter. Life was like that, full of twists. Every day brought different things, good and bad, sour, sweet, bitter, hot, salty. You never knew what flavor lay ahead. That uncertainty is what gave life its ups and downs and what let so many great stories be born. The two of them in the room presented a strange sight. A white-haired centenarian in shabby clothes talking about the vicissitudes of life with a girl in the prime of youth. Grindelwald could have been Ida's grandfather, yet despite an abyssal generational gap, they talked as if they had been old friends reunited. Under the silver moonlight, with a little wine loosening their tongues, they confessed thoughts they had never shared with anyone. They both understood that by morning they would remember nothing of that night. For now, beneath the pale moon, they spoke as if their words had no consequences. "Bah, the magic world is full of fools," Grindelwald scoffed. "If they had accepted my ideas back then, there would have been no war. So many lives, so much magic wouldn't have been wasted. We would have been greater, nobler. This is a right every wizard should have." "Genius goes left, madness goes right," Ida replied. "You thought you were born to change the world, so you stubbornly turned right and refused to fit in. The high and mighty saw you as a madman. The worst part was that you failed. Because you failed, your ideals became empty words. You and your followers weren't liberators. You were madmen trying to overthrow the whole magic world." Grindelwald's voice carried contempt. Contempt for the ruling and for the conservatives who clung to old ways. Magic should live on sunlit land, not hidden in foul sewers, not hunted like rats. Their prejudice and conservatism squandered the wizard's last chance. There is a thin line between visionary and lunatic. Grindelwald's ideas outran his age. The institutions he attacked were too entrenched, and so he became the mad idealist they feared. His flaws, disregard for life, obsessive single-mindedness, grew larger when no one understood him. He stopped at nothing to reach his goals, invoking that old excuse, for the greater good. Arrogant, self-important, he preached outside the law, raised forces, trained soldiers. The crimes he and his followers committed brought suffering across Europe. Only a legendary duel in 1945, when his love stood against him, finally ended his plans and cleared Europe's dark clouds. Ida dwelled on the phrase, "magic should live on sunlit land." It sounded almost Bismarckian. Perhaps because they were both Germanic, she thought, their instincts had a resemblance. "I find myself longing for the world you describe," she admitted. She pictured a place where Grindelwald had won. Wizards wouldn't have to shrink their lives. They wouldn't be ostracized by their own kind because of blood or origin. If he and his followers had kept their original intentions, it would have been a fairer world for wizards. The world saved by Dumbledore and others was beautiful in one sense. No slaughter, no mass panic, but its deep-seated illnesses persisted. Purebloods looked down on half-bloods and Muggleborns. Muggle-born wizards were insultingly called mudbloods, dismissed as unfit for magic, deemed impure. They formed the lowest rung of wizarding society. Muggleborn's upward mobility was blocked. Only once had a minister of magic come from a Muggle background, an exception rather than the rule. A few ministers had been sympathetic to Muggleborns or close to Muggles, but their tenures were short. Many were forced out. Some died for it. For reasons like this, Ida found herself drawn to the fairness Grindelwald claimed to want. "It's a pity I couldn't bring my followers to that dream," Grindelwald said with a trace of regret. "If we had succeeded, you wouldn't have suffered. When your soul bloomed with magic, you would have been your family's pride. If that had happened, the original owner of this life would probably have had a happy childhood, and I wouldn't have had the chance to experience the strange wonders of this world." Ida thought. She said nothing, and Grindelwald took her silence to mean she was imagining that lost childhood. He didn't interrupt her reverie. He looked toward the distant horizon, and Credence's face came to him. If Credence had not become an obscurus, if he had not been used, what might he have achieved? What heights could a wizard with such raw brilliance have reached? The loss was a tally not only of lives, but of wasted promise. Ida's happier childhood, Credence's undamaged talent, both were casualties in the fragile bubble of Grindelwald's idealism. It was a beautiful dream that burst at the slightest touch. 197. Reward foam, a cluster of tiny bubbles, flashes colors in the sunlight. It's beautiful but fragile and illusory. Even without outside disturbance, it bursts quickly and leaves nothing behind. Fantasies are like that. Foam on water, shadows in a mirror, morning dew. Indulge in them, and you sap your fighting spirit, soften your resolve, and stop moving forward. The sweetness of the hot cocoa had already been watered down, but the casual conversations between Ada and Grindelwald deepened their relationship. That was Grindelwald's charm. He could make people listen, make them treat his words like gospel. Ada lacked that magnetism, and it was one reason she had little influence at school. Without that kind of presence, she could not become a true leader. She needed to cultivate it, to learn how to bend talent into authority. Only then could she hope to eclipse Dumbledore and Grindelwald. Otherwise, she would always be a frontline fighter or a lone wolf. In Nurmengard, Ada learned little proper magic and received no private tutoring from the first-generation Black Demon King. Yet she gained something far more important. Time with Grindelwald taught her that talent alone wasn't enough. Determination and confidence had to match it. He showed her what a leader really was and where her own shortcomings lay. She studied his successes and his mistakes, living proof that the power of a man standing before you could outweigh any written theory. No textbook could replace personal instruction from the first-generation Black Demon King. That, Ada decided, was her greatest gain. If Lord Voldemort had studied Grindelwald more carefully, perhaps his influence would have taken a different shape. Maybe he would not have pushed himself to such extremes in pursuit of his goals. As for adopting Grindelwald's mantle, resurrecting slogans like "for the greater good," or cheering for breathing in the sunlight, and some notion of relative fairness, Ada had no intention of retracing that path. It failed in 1945. It would be harder now, and given her background, even more difficult. Two generations of Dark Lords with differing ideals both tried to remake the world through violence and war, and only produced more violence and war. Even walking a road paved by the bones of predecessors offered little hope. For now, Ada had no easy solution. Rather than scheming how to slay a dragon, she needed to strengthen herself. Without that, even the best plan would be useless. A leader who can be easily broken will not win followers. Perhaps that was why Dumbledore had brought Ada to Nurmengard, to let Grindelwald stand as a lighthouse, guiding her through the fog. Grindelwald also answered a question that had tormented Ada for a long time. Do all dark wizards fall into depravity? Does the study of dark arts drag people into the mire until they become violent, extreme, even psychopathic? When she asked, she regretted it almost at once. Grindelwald looked at her as if she were naive. Maybe it was the good weather, or maybe the sausages tasted like home, but Grindelwald shrugged and replied, "Do I look mentally unstable?" He didn't. Grindelwald did not fit the caricature of a dark wizard. He was one of the most proficient practitioners of dark arts in the world. Yet, in Ada's view, the dark arts had not destroyed him. He explained that the influence of dark arts falls into two kinds, passive and active. Dark magic requires not only magical power, but often extreme negative emotion to function. If someone is continuously exposed to those emotions, over time the dark arts can corrupt them from within. That is the passive influence. Many Death Eaters and other dark wizards, unable to resist the pleasure of killing or torturing, are gradually consumed by this corrupting influence and grow extreme and insane. The other kind is active. The user willingly embraces the dark arts influence, seeking dangerous transformations to gain greater power. That path is often irreversible and makes the practitioner increasingly dangerous. Powerful wizards like Voldemort gained strength that way, but they paid a steep price, and only personal strength could carry them through the process. A counterexample was Ada's former Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Glover Cecil. He lacked the strength to complete such a transformation and would have died in the summer of 1990 if Dumbledore hadn't saved him. As long as one does not actively seek transformation like Voldemort, resisting the passive influence is possible. That resistance requires a solid foundation of personal strength and a strong inner core, or external anchors, love, or someone you love. In the world of magic, Grindelwald said, "Love is the most powerful force. It can form ancient protections against curses and serve as an inner fortress against the dark arts invasion of the mind. He didn't speak much of Voldemort, but his tone betrayed some contempt. He acknowledged Voldemort's power, but disdained his methods. Grindelwald's followers, after killing an enemy, would even prepare a proper coffin. He looked down on a colleague who burned and destroyed with theatrical cruelty. As for those who could not resist the dark arts' passive pull, Grindelwald had little patience. He called them fools. Ada, who had once wavered about the dark arts, recognized herself in that warning. Nurmengard was steeped in study, and Hogwarts was no different. Final exams were nearing. On top of exams, Gryffindor was dealing with other troubles. The infighting that followed Harry and his friends' loss of 150 points had cost Gryffindor its shot at the House Cup. Harry was no longer seen as a hero by some of his housemates, but as that person. One student involved in the quarrel was serving a month-long detention. Another hadn't returned to school since the incident. Though no official announcement had been made, rumor among students naturally assumed Ada had been expelled. Fred and George, worried about her, were frantic. Besides pestering Professor McGonagall, they had sent many letters to the borough, but Mr. and Mrs. Weasley urged them to calm down. With Ada in Nurmengard and the twins unable to get news from McGonagall, anxiety only grew. Harry's punishment had been decided as well. Not only would he lose more points, but he and Hagrid were to go into the Forbidden Forest at night to investigate a slain unicorn. Whether luck or misfortune, while in the forest, Harry encountered Quirrell drinking the unicorn's blood, and he jumped to the conclusion that Snape was to blame, mistaking the hooded figure in the trees for the potions master. Far away in Austria, Ada still had no idea what was unfolding at Hogwarts. She counted the days she had been in Nurmengard on her fingers. The time with Grindelwald was rewarding, but her homesickness deepened. She missed everything about Hogwarts, especially her friends. The night was cold as water. Mountain nights always were, and moonlight washed the castle in silver. Ada lay curled on the stiff bed. In the month she'd lived at Nurmengard, she'd grown used to the rough sleeping and the fierce chill. The hearth had sunk to embers. She reached a hand out from the covers and snapped her fingers. Under the touch of magic, the flames leapt back up and the room warmed again. During the day, the castle that normally held only 2 people had received a third visitor. Phoenix Fawkes had come by at the right hour with Dumbledore's message. He would arrive the next day to take Ada back to Hogwarts. Ada brightened at the news. She had been away a month and finally could go home. In that month, she had found a clearer plan for a life that had been full of confusion and had grown steadier. It was progress Dumbledore had hoped for when he brought her here, to force her, by meeting Grindelwald, to find a direction and to recognize her own worth. Their relationship had already fractured after earlier mistakes. At this point, Dumbledore could no longer guide her directly. Everything he said or did would be interpreted as having ulterior motives. Bridging that gap would take time he no longer had. At Hogwarts, the only person who could step in was Professor Minerva McGonagall, who could teach Ada transfiguration and model integrity, but she could not lead Ada into the rarer, thornier places Ada might go. Those heights were not paths McGonagall herself had walked. She could not guide Ada through that particular terrain. Dumbledore had originally been the right person. But starting with Benedict Fewley, the shadow of Lord Voldemort had begun to gather over Hogwarts again. Time pressed. He had a feeling that Quirrell was only the first of many threats after the Philosopher's Stone. Greater conspiracies would form around Harry and Voldemort. Harry needed him, needed most of his attention. He could not spare the care and guidance Ada deserved. On that morning in the Shrieking Shack, Dumbledore had thought long and hard and reconsidered his earlier risky option. Grindelwald as a surrogate. It was dangerous, and he was hesitant, preferring to observe longer. Events forced his hand. The Gryffindor quarrel pushed him to end his watch and bring Ada to Nurmengard sooner than he had planned. The quarrel had been sparked by Harry, but an innocent Ada had been caught and punished unfairly. Everyone involved shared blame. Everyone deserved consequence. Punishing Ada would have been just, but it would have driven her farther away from both Dumbledore and Harry. Not punishing her would have been unjust to the others. Faced with that thorn, Dumbledore reached for the option he'd set aside and sent her to Grindelwald. There was another reason for his choice. In the conflict, Ada had done something reckless. She lowered her wand before Professor McGonagall. It was a dangerous, brave move, and Dumbledore took it as a sign. He chose to trust Grindelwald and to trust Ada. In the empty castle, neither of them had slept well. Grindelwald, who lived on the top floor, found he was not entirely ready to part with his uninvited guest. He was getting old, and such things gnawed at him. The next morning, they sat at opposite ends of the long dining table and said little. When the silence broke, it was not, as might be expected, Grindelwald who spoke first. "I bartered for a little extra food yesterday," Ada said. "It should last a few more days. If you need anything." "There's no need," Grindelwald answered, head bent as he cut his bacon. "Cocoa, tea bags, those are all in the kitchen, if you want them." He lifted his eyes then, bland and untroubled. "You don't need to fuss." Ada pointed toward the kitchen, then snapped. "Likewise, there's no need for your pardon." She slammed her hand on the table and stood up. "Grindelwald, did the orphanage in Hogwarts not teach you politeness?" He said mildly. The cool dismissal made all of Ada's efforts feel pointless. She pushed away her breakfast and went straight back to her room, not bothering with the elderly man she had come to see. Grindelwald continued his meal, unruffled. After a while, Ada reappeared, in a sky-blue robe and carrying her bag, just as she had on the day she arrived. "Is there truly nothing you want to say to me?" she asked. "After today, we may never see each other again." "If we are never going to see each other, there's all the less reason for words," Grindelwald replied, voice flat. "Or are you sentimental about every passerby? If so, you are very soft-hearted." Ada picked up a roll and then put it down. She hated goodbyes, but she needed to face this one, and Grindelwald's indifference made that harder. Anger rose in her. She wanted nothing more than to leave this decaying place behind. Neither of them spoke again. The silence was finally broken when a phoenix cried from above and someone eased the protective enchantments at the gate. Ada stood and walked out. Grindelwald remained in his high-backed chair, watching her go. A few paces down the path she stopped, turned her back to him, and said, "Goodbye. Don't die too soon. I'll live my life the way I choose. Maybe I'll even change the world. You must live long enough to see it." On the platform, Dumbledore watched her emerge. "I thought I might have to wait longer," he said. "If you'd gone in and said goodbye, you'd see why I came out so fast," Ada replied, glancing at the carved inscription above the gate. She would never forget her time at Newmengard. "No need. Let's go," Dumbledore said with a soft smile. "I'm very pleased with how much you've grown, Ada." She shaded her eyes against the light to look at him. He had so much he could have said about the castle and the man inside it, but he said nothing, only looked toward the entrance with the same distant gaze he carried when staring into the mirror of Erised. "Come along now. The two Mr. Weasley miss you terribly. While you were away, they've been treating Minerva's office like a common room," Dumbledore chided gently and called to Fawkes. With a flare of phoenix fire, Dumbledore and Ada vanished from the platform. Inside the castle, Grindelwald stayed seated until Fawkes' clear cry rose again. Then he rose slowly and climbed the stairs. 199. Anxious Harry Potter. From the distant Austrian mainland back to Hogwarts in the Scottish Highlands, Phoenix Fawkes did not take long, even with 2 passengers. Compared with the portkey she had used to go to Austria, Ada still preferred traveling by Phoenix. At least she didn't get motion sick. Dumbledore did not bring her straight back to the castle, however. They appeared in the empty, shrieking shack. The Weasley twins hadn't been back since Ada left. Seeing the familiar furnishings, Ada finally felt truly at home. The shack wasn't hers, but everything in it was tied to her, full of memories. Fawkes settled on a nearby bookshelf, preening, while Dumbledore took the rocking chair by the window, Ada's chair originally. Having lost it, she sat on the sofa instead, feeling put upon. Fortunately, the sofa was comfortable. Dumbledore sat with his eyes closed. Ada watched him for a moment and then said, "You're stopping here, instead of going straight back to school. If you have something to say, you might as well say it." She wouldn't have dared speak like that in the past. She would have waited for him to speak first. Dumbledore rocked gently. "No one at Hogwarts knows I left to fetch you from Nurmengard. They think I went to the ministry for a meeting. Albus Dumbledore being absent is an excellent opportunity. You really plan everything down to the last detail, Ada said. Aren't you afraid he'll see through your ruse and decide to stay? The Philosopher's Stone is not my only option. I can afford to wait, Dumbledore said. He cannot. Several unicorns have been killed in the Forbidden Forest recently, and their blood has been taken. You know what that implies. Unicorns were sacred. Their hair made wands, their horns could purify, and legend said drinking from a goblet carved of horn brought health. But unicorn blood was a cursed salvation. It could prolong life, but anyone who drank it would be damned to half-life. Few would willingly kill a unicorn for the price. Quirrell had, under the coercion of a darker master. Having nearly obtained the stone, Quirrell would throw himself into any trap. Dumbledore could not afford the stone to be walked out of the castle. If Quirrell left, finding him again might prove impossible. That was why Dumbledore had taken the risk of hiding in the Shrieking Shack, to force the matter and end it. Aren't you worried Harry might follow and something go wrong? Ada asked. Or are you absolutely confident in your plan? Dumbledore opened his eyes and looked at her. Have I not already suffered from my own overconfidence because of you? Harry will not be in danger. He has a protection within him, and I have another precaution to make sure the plan succeeds. That other precaution doesn't involve me, does it? Ada asked dryly. So you ended my exile now and had me come back because everyone assumes I've been expelled and I won't appear at school, so I can help, right? Dumbledore ignored the sarcasm. Do you have anything to eat here, or in that handbag of yours? No, everything was left in Nurmengard. Then go into the village and buy something, Dumbledore said. You couldn't bear to see an old man over 100 years old starve, could you? Ada stepped toward him and held out her hand for money. Dumbledore simply looked at her with his blue eyes, unmoved. Money. If you don't have money, you'll starve. Still, he did not produce anything. Ada stuck out her hand until Dumbledore, with a small sigh, put a coin purse into it. She weighed it casually, heard the coins clink, pulled up her hood, and left the Shrieking Shack. Dumbledore settled back into the rocking chair and closed his eyes, pleased with himself. It had seemed right to send Ada to Nurmengard after all. Whether he would be so content once he learned how Grindelwald had changed Ada's views on the dark arts was another question. Meanwhile, at Hogwarts, Harry was pacing on the edge of hysteria. The day was muggy. He couldn't concentrate in class. A small animal seemed to be clawing at his chest, and the faint throb from his scar made him raw and irritable. Since seeing Lord Voldemort drinking unicorn blood, the sting in his forehead had kept him from sleeping well. A warning. Harry felt that something was about to happen. Snape was about to make his move. A few days earlier, Ada had reminded Ron about a dragon egg, so Harry and Hermione had gone to Hagrid to check. The stranger who had lost out over the dragon egg had learned from Hagrid how to handle a three-headed dog, which meant that someone could now get past the Guardian without danger. In Harry's mind, that made the stone less safe than before. Dumbledore had always been at school to stop things, but today he had gone again and hadn't returned by lunchtime. Without Dumbledore, no one stood between Snape and the stone. Dinner in the Great Hall was tense. Dumbledore's chair at the teacher's table remained empty. Harry could only stare at that vacancy and imagine Snape presenting the Philosopher's Stone to Lord Voldemort. After the meal, the trio went straight to Professor McGonagall's office. When is Professor Dumbledore coming back? We want to see him, Hermione blurted. Why do you need to see him? McGonagall asked, puzzled. Because Snape, someone is trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone, and only Dumbledore can stop him, Harry said before Hermione could say more. McGonagall's expression stiffened. She dropped the book she was reading and said, Dumbledore has gone to London and won't be back until tomorrow. I don't know who told you about the Philosopher's Stone, but be reassured, no one can steal it. It is heavily protected. Her insistence was too little to soothe them. They were only first years. They had no authority to question a professor. Hermione looked helpless. But what can we do? Professor McGonagall doesn't believe us. Harry made a reckless decision. What if we get the stone first? Are you crazy? Hermione cried. You can't. Think about Ada. She was expelled for trying to lay a hand on a classmate. Do you want that to happen to you? Ada won't be expelled, Ron blurted fiercely. He meant it, but Harry and Hermione were focused on the stone, not Ada's fate. Hermione tried to reason with him. Fred and George are already behaving like lunatics, blocking McGonagall's door every day. Do you want us to end up like that too? Hermione felt torn. She cared about Ada, but couldn't let Harry rush headlong into danger. Still, Harry's argument was simple and unyielding. He laid out what he knew and why it mattered. By the end, Ron and Hermione were convinced. The three of them agreed to protect the stone together. Even if it meant being expelled, they'd do it as a group. After they left, McGonagall sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. Those three were harder to manage than Ada ever had been. A sterner word would have made Ada obedient. These children, however, were made of different stuff. Sighing, McGonagall bent to pick up the scattered books. No doubt the next visitors would arrive soon, and the Weasley twins, unsurprising as ever, were already on their way. 200. Why are you here? Late at night, Harry, Ron, and Hermione had subdued Neville Longbottom, the brave Gryffindor who had tried to stop them. Poor Neville lay on the cold floor, small and helpless under the Petrificus Talus. After getting past him, the trio found Peeves blocking their way. Harry reacted quickly, mimicked the tone of the Bloody Baron, and sent the poltergeist fleeing, allowing them to enter the restricted corridor on the 4th floor. They were too late for some things. Fluffy, the three-headed dog, was already fast asleep, a harp lying at his feet, one they assumed Snape had left. The trio dropped through the trapdoor, past Hagrid's dog, and landed in Professor Sprout's greenhouse where Devil's Snare waited. Hermione, who had paid careful attention in herbology, guided them out of the strangling plant. The strange, bluebell-like flames in the pot forced the Devil's Snare to recoil within seconds. Next came Professor Flitwick's flying keys. Showing quick reflexes and Gryffindor nerve, Harry reached and snatched the right key without needing any additional slowing spells. Then the giant chessboard. Ron had his moment. He directed the game with ease and won, but to protect Harry and Hermione, he had to sacrifice himself. He fell heavily and passed out. Only Harry and Hermione remained to protect the stone. In the next room, they found the troll already rendered unconscious. Quirrell's challenge had been designed to be easily bypassed by someone who could handle trolls. He would have anticipated that. They moved on to Snape's test, the bottles of potion. Hermione, not Esmeralda, and lacking any special knowledge of these particular brews, worked it out by deduction. After choosing the correct vial to protect against the black flames, they split up, one to go on, one to stay behind. That left only Snape, or so they thought. When Harry pushed open the final door, he froze. It was not Snape who stood over the last defense. It was Professor Quirrell, or at least Quirrell as he had always known him. Since Halloween, Harry had suspected Snape despite what Hagrid had said. He had fixed his mistrust and had kept it even when others cautioned him. Seeing Quirrell there did not feel right, and only when Quirrell revealed the truth did Harry begin to understand. The last obstacle protecting the Philosopher's Stone was the Mirror of Erised, set by Dumbledore. Quirrell could not pass the mirror's test. Only when an unmistakable, sibilant whisper from the back of Quirrell's head, Lord Voldemort's voice, reminded him of Harry did Quirrell remember his purpose. He led the boy to the mirror. Harry looked into it and saw himself take the small red stone and slip it into his pocket. Then, impossibly, a small weight dropped into his trousers. The stone was in his pocket. Quirrell, who had tried every trick to get it, watched in disbelief. Harry had somehow obtained it. Harry tried to bluff and lie his way past them, but he could not fool the thing attached to Quirrell's head. As he tried to snatch Harry, Quirrell found he could not touch him. The moment his left hand made contact, it recoiled, and he screamed as if burned. The skin blistered and blackened. "Master, I can't catch him! My hand! My hand!" Quirrell cried, racked with pain and begging for forgiveness. "Then kill him, you fool! Quickly!" Lord Voldemort's grinding voice filled the underground room. Quirrell drew his wand and raised it at Harry as the boy ran toward the black flames. He was about to utter a deadly spell when a clear, bell-like voice rang out across the chamber. "You're late. It's a pity I didn't see your astonished expression." Esmeralda Twister stepped through the black flames into the underground room. She stood between Harry and Quirrell, wand raised, just as Dumbledore might have stood. Harry stared. Quirrell's face mirrored his own shock. Neither could fathom how she had appeared there. Flashback. While Harry, Ron, and Hermione hurried to Professor McGonagall's office, Esmeralda had slipped back into the castle under cover of night. In her 3 years at Hogwarts, she had explored every corridor with Fred and George Weasley. Under a disillusionment charm, she had moved past students and intercepted the twins as they went to visit Professor McGonagall. They hid in an empty classroom near the 4th floor restricted corridor. Fred and George greeted her with big, wordless hugs. No questions about where she had been could match the relief of reunion. The Marauder's map lay open on a table, weighted by 2 flasks containing the fire-repelling potion Esmeralda carried. George had brought the map from the dormitory. Fred had coaxed the flasks out of the girls' dormitory with a trick worthy of the twins and Angelina's indignation. "Esmeralda, are you really going to help Dumbledore watch over Harry?" Fred wanted to know. He still resented Dumbledore a little for hiding her whereabouts. "He helped me, so I help him back. Less debt, less obligation." Or that Esmeralda said coolly, "Besides, I want to test myself." "You're different," George observed. He had a sharp eye for changes. "You've changed since you went away." "I can't speak of that place yet," Esmeralda replied. "I met an old man there who taught me a lot. It's why I can't send letters back. There's no way for owls to reach it. It was an unforgettable journey." "That journey was so unforgettable you didn't write once," Fred grumbled, rolling his eyes. "You know how worried Professor McGonagall was?" They laughed and bickered like brothers. Neither Fred nor George would stand idly by because Esmeralda had left school. Anyone who'd driven her away would answer to them. In front of the twins, everyone was equal. Not even the headmaster would get special treatment once they set their minds to something. Fred showed off some of their latest experiments, a short-lived sickness charm with an antidote still in progress. George kept his eyes on the map. "They're moving. Harry's left the common room with Ron and Hermione," George said. Watching the tower was easier than scanning the crowded common room. As soon as the 3 left, they would be spotted. "Let's wait until they go in," Esmeralda said, standing on the desk and listening. "We'll go in after them. Fluffy's too pitiful tonight to be left alone." Harry did not know that it was Quirrell awaiting him rather than Snape, nor that something sinister clung to the back of Quirrell's skull. He had simply brought his friends to help protect the stone. He was still only a boy, not yet 12. He could not foresee how they were supposed to get through the professor's protections. If the safeguards had been tighter or more inventive, they might have been stopped long before they reached the stone. Harry had never wondered how a first year could stand between Lord Voldemort and what he wanted. Was it the courage gifted by Fish Leong? If he lacked that strange protection, how would he have resisted Quirrell's control? It was the protagonist's halo, luck and destiny wrapped together. When Harry and Hermione reached the troll room, Esmeralda and the twins had just arrived at the giant chessboard. They found Ron lying on his back and rushed to check him. Seeing he was only unconscious, they relaxed. Esmeralda waved her wand, and under a reviving charm, Ron stirred and woke. For a moment, stunned by the sight of her and the twins around him, he almost fainted again. "How are you here?" he asked, bewildered. Tang Yuan had adjusted the sequence of events at the end of the school year, allowing Quirrell to attempt to steal the Philosopher's Stone a few days earlier.